Hey, good evening, and welcome to the Comics Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club. It's December 2020. This year is almost over. Thank God, this year is almost over. And we're gonna end this year with a fantastic selection for the Comics Masterpiece Club. Honestly, it's kind of the text of comics, and we should have started with this book. Started the club with this book, but I'm very, very happy to bring us Understanding Comics with our guest tonight, Mr. Scott McCloud. Hello, Scott. How are you, my friend?
Just great, Brian. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, thanks so much for participating. I have a modern copy of the copy here, but
Yeah.
I brought my actual home copy,
Yeah.
which has a broken spine and has been really well read. And this is a book that it's always been a part of, how I think about comics. And it's a very powerful book. And I really want to thank you for, it's been 20 something years, but thank you for
even more. You're very kind. It's actually that thing's been around now. It's not what, 93. So we're looking at 27 years.
27 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Coming up on the 30th anniversary. Yeah.
Yeah. Getting close.
Yeah. You're gonna have to do
see the gray hairs. I got the gray hairs in the follow-up books, but I don't have them yet. Nah.
Yeah, absolutely. So my first question in these interviews is, it's always the same one. I love this question. You are very clearly a very smart person. You're very clearly a very talented person. Of all of the things that you could be putting that brains and talents to, why comics? Of all the cockamamie things you could be doing, what is it about comics? What is it that it thrills you, that sets you on fire, that makes it that you had to write a book of how to understand them? Why?
It's a good question, and there's actually like 10 different answers. I'll try to give you like 3 or 4 of them. But the first is just 2 words, Kurt Busiek.
Yeah.
Because it's really true. Like when we say Kurt got me into comics in middle school, because we went to the same as junior high school is what we call it up in New England, whatever. It's basically middle school. We were together in the cafeteria. He got me into comics, and he really had to try. That is, I thought I was too old for comics. I thought I was too smart for comics. I thought comics were junk. So the fact that Kurt had to try hard to get me to even try comics means that if he wasn't there, I wouldn't be in them today. So it really is his fault. You can totally blame him. But what finally, I guess what pulled me in after like having all these obsessions as a kid I was obsessed with chess. I was obsessed with microbiology. I was obsessed with politics, all these crazy things before I was like about 13, 14 when I met Kurt. But what finally drew me in is like, first he made me a reader, but also I wasn't necessarily going to make him. But then I saw some Steranko, I saw some Neil Adams, I saw some Jim Starlin, and like in the space of about a year, I got this feeling like, oh wow, you know what? There's even as I was a really pretentious kid, right? So I'm thinking this farm has artistic potential, this kind of Poindextery conviction that comics, there's stuff that people can do with comics. And not only were people doing interesting things with comics, but like all at once I was getting this feeling that, this thing's like a blank page. Like there's other interesting stuff that maybe hasn't been done yet. And maybe I could do that. And so even from the very beginning, I was kind of like baby inventor, formalist guy. Just because my dad was an inventor, literally an inventor. He invented like guidance systems for missiles and stuff. And so it was that scientist part of me that like glommed onto it. And then that just became my obsession. That started like I was 15 years old. And I remember I said to Kurt, I'm going to be a comic book artist. And, Kurt was like, yeah, whatever. He didn't care.
I'm actually talking to Kurt, I want to say in 2 months.
Good.
We're going to talk about Marvels, or at least that's the pretext for having the conversation about comics. But were you two in the same grade or different grade? Or same.
I think we met in 7th grade, and then we started like really like bonding over comics. Like would have been like 8th grade. Before that, what happened was we had a deal. Like we would just like in the cafeteria, we would tell each other routines from like Monty Python or whatever, like typical nerd stuff, like real, like we are the nerds and like all those like E.T. and Stranger Things. That's basically us.
Yeah.
And we had a deal because I was obsessed with chess right before comics, and Kurt could play chess. He was one of the kids who could play chess, and he wanted to get away from his dad, who anytime he was home would give him chores to do. He didn't want to do chores, so he would come over to my house after. And he didn't, he didn't really want to play chess that much, but I had a pool table, so we had a deal. We would play pool, and then after we played pool, he would play me a game of chess. So it was like a 1-for-1 thing because I cared more about the chess. And that was the period when he started, like he pushed me on these things. Eventually got me to read a stack of Daredevils, stack of X-Men. But like looking back on it now, I think of that whole long period where I was just a superhero fan, but actually it wasn't that long, because right away I started finding the other stuff. Because we had we were in Boston, right, or a suburb. We were Lexington, Massachusetts, suburb. So we had the Million Year Picnic was already in existence at that time.
Very nice, yeah.
Yeah, so we go down to Cambridge, and like these are, you're in that fellowship of like all-time great stores, and so of course the Picnic is like one of the early ones.
Yeah.
And that's, so I started getting into Cerebus, I started getting into ElfQuest. Then I'm discovering the old spirits, and all of a sudden I'm obsessed by Will Eisner. And then I'm like, it's creepy and eerie. And then all of a sudden it's heavy metal, and I'm getting into the European stuff. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, there's a million roads to comics. Yeah, and by the time I go to college, that's the way I'm thinking.
Yeah. And so would you credit the Million Year Picnic as increasing your literacy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not even just the store itself, but also Rich Howell and Carol Kalish.
Yeah.
Because they were kind of our mentors, Kurt and me both. I think Kurt might have introduced me to the two of them.
Yeah.
And so we would do things. We would hang out at their apartment. We even did some work together that never got published for a publisher that went belly up. But I just remember they gave me so much really great advice. I mean, Carol, of course, went on to run a lot of the stuff going on at Marvel in those days or shortly thereafter. And we lost her very early, sadly. Yeah. But both of them were real mentors, and they helped us. They were basically unpaid editors for the unpaid cartoonists that we were. And they just had such great advice. There's one thing that Rich said that always stuck with me. I remember saying to him, Corto Maltese, Hugo Pratt, that's his name. Yep. So the great artist, Hugo Pratt, great European cartoonist. And I went to Rich once and I said, hey, have you heard of this guy, Hugo Pratt? And Rich says, yeah, I've heard of him. And I said, well, so is he good? Do you like him? And Rich says, well, yes and no. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he says, yes, he's good. And no, I don't like him. Yeah. What a great answer. It's like, it's like right away, my whole aesthetic world is like, oh, okay. All right. So there can be things like that you recognize are good, but for whatever reason, it doesn't hit you in the heart.
It doesn't. Yeah, exactly. It doesn't speak to you. It doesn't push your buttons, but you see the craft and you see the skill and the talent that's involved. And it's fascinating too, because I can think of several cartoonists that are like that, who I don't particularly like the content that they actually produce, but I can see how their aesthetic choices have changed comics for the better. It's utterly fascinating. Because in so many ways, I think that comics are, as a visual medium, it's not like movies and television where, well, certainly there are stylists, right? But basically there's kind of one way to tell a story, kind of, whereas in comics there's 50 ways to do it. There's 100 ways to do it. And I've never quite understood why that is, and yet it's true.
Well, it's a more opaque medium, right? Because the style of the artist is more in your face.
Yeah.
And like if you think about it, you can have different cinematographers, you can have a different visual style, you can have a lot of things different, from show to show, from movie to movie, from director to director.
Yeah.
But if it's live action, it's going to have a lot in common visually, right? Yeah. It's going to move the set. A person walking down the street has a particular rhythm to it. Light falls in a certain way. Trees look a certain way. It doesn't matter who the director is. An elm tree is going to look like an elm tree, right? Yeah. But when a different artist is drawing it, you're asking a lot more of the reader. And a reader has to plow through what might be very idiosyncratic drawing styles. And sometimes that's a problem. Sometimes it's a barrier. In fact, often it's a barrier. It's possible that one of the reasons that comics isn't quite as dominant a mass medium, like in a market sense, it might just be because you can't always lose yourself in it. The cartoonist style is kind of in your face, and so it can be drawings on a page. The drawings don't necessarily disappear instantly the way that the fact that a movie is light projected on a wall disappears, right? Yeah. You forget about that in 10 seconds if you see a movie.
Sure.
But you can go a whole book never forgetting that it's drawn. And it's beautiful. The hand of the artist, it's quirky, it's idiosyncratic, but it can also be a barrier. So, like I always like to say, if you're like in serial fiction, when you're following like superhero comics or something that, you're 70 issues in, what happens when a new artist comes in is it can be really upsetting because all of your favorite characters have been replaced by drawings of your favorite characters. Right? You know what I mean?
Sure,
it's like, shit, now it's drawings again.
Right.
That's not what he looks like. Even if the old artist was crappy.
Yeah.
That you had managed to work your way through the style so that the disbelief just melted away and now they were people, and that just goes away. You have to do it all over again if a new artist comes on.
Yeah. I think there's another piece of it too, in that the audience participates in the reading of comics.
Oh yeah.
You don't in film in the same way, right? Because film
not in the same way.
Film unspools at whatever it is, 32 frames per second or whatever it is.
Yeah, 20. Yeah. Oh no, 20, animation is 24. Yeah, 30.
Whatever it is, it's coming at you at a speed, and you can't stop that. You can't. Yeah. You can pause it. You can, but it's not like in comics. In comics, I constantly am going, wait, let me go back 4 pages and let me reread that sequence again. Now I see what they were. Now I get it, right? You don't do that in film. I mean, you can, I don't know. I watched Come Back to the Five and Dime Jimmy Dean probably 6 times in a row before I uncracked it, But it's not the same because you don't have control as an audience member of what you're taking in.
That's right. In movies, and television, in the moving image, it's always now.
Yeah.
Right. It's always now. And whatever's to come, that's just anticipation. Whatever happened in the past, it's just memory, right?
Yeah.
And that's true in almost all other art forms. It's true in theater. It's true even when you're reading a novel, even though the words are around you, you haven't really decoded them, right? So you're just like in that one little phrase that you're reading at a given time. It's always now. In comics, past, present, and future, it's all around you. And it's the only medium that I can think of in which that's a defining characteristic. But you said like as far as reader control, now of course the fact that readers in comics have to fill in the blanks a lot. We do that in film, of course. We do that with the cut, and people like really early on in the 20th century, there were like, all these Russian film theorists and whatnot, like Kuleshov, where we're talking about this idea that like if you can have the exact same clip followed by, second clip A, and you're going to interpret the first one differently depending on what you juxtapose it with. So you'd had like a shot of a man followed by a bowl of soup, and now you think that he looks hungry, or you have a shot of a man followed by a little girl in a coffin, you think he looks sad, but it's the exact same shot of the guy both times, right? Yeah. So that's analogous what happens in comics is that participation between shots. But what you were talking about, where it's just like going from one frame to the next, now you're just talking about the persistence of vision. It's mechanical, right? You know, we just stitch that stuff together without really thinking.
Yeah, I mean, to me, when I go and talk to students at elementary schools or whatever, my go-to example is always Lucy pulling the football from Charlie Brown, because everybody knows that image, right? Like everybody,
especially now with all the political analogies.
Yeah, exactly. So you picture it in your head without even thinking. But if you actually look at the sequence of comics, and Schultz did that 12 times probably through his career, right? He redrew it several times, but every time Charlie's running towards the football, Lucy has pulled away the football, right? But yet no point do you see the action happening. The audience is the one who pulls away the football.
That's right.
Kids. And when you tell them like that, you're the one who pulled away the football, they go, wait, hold on, what? And that's kind of the magic of comics, the friction of comics, the excitement and the thrill of comics, that you can draw the reader to a conclusion narratively. That I understand what you're saying about the emotional content between showing a funeral versus showing a bowl of soup, but it's not the same. It's not the same connection that the audience makes. Right.
I think the important thing is that we not claim for comics the exclusive domain of audiences filling in with imagination. But when in comics it's so much more powerful that way. Yeah. And that there's like a secret shadow world of comics. If like I walk into Comix Experience right now, once it's legal again to browse the way we used to. Right,
we can shop.
You still go in, but you just got to keep your distance. Okay. Right. I mean, for the people viewing at home, I'm in Southern California. You're up in San Francisco, or Berkeley. No, wait, San Francisco proper. Yeah. The mothership.
Yeah.
And so so I can go into the store, and you can look around. You can see 1,000 graphic novels and comics all around you, right? And you can look in every single one of them, and you're going to see panels and art. You're going to see words. You're going to see design choices. You're going to see all this stuff. But the most important thing that you never, ever see is all the panels they left out.
Yeah.
They left that those were decisions that shaped that art form. Yeah. And like what Schultz leaves out is just so important. Just as much as the panels that he includes that he didn't have to. Yeah. Like I actually in my workshops, I show a Peanuts Sunday page that's really wonderful, this sort of snowball sequence. And I show that you can tell the entire thing in 4 panels. But then we have to actually talk about, well, why did Schultz put all those extra panels in? What does it get him to have those pauses, those slow moments, those moments to think about it, those moments of anticipation? That's part of the art too.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to me that comics, in a lot of ways, more than almost any other media, is a medium of reduction, simplification, trying to get to the best way to communicate one image to another.
Right. How many points does it take to describe a line?
Yeah.
And we do sometimes put the extra points in. Maybe there's a reason. Maybe we do want to slow things down. But a lot of the times it's that brevity. There's brevity to a lot of really great comics. Yeah. Even the ones that last for 300 or 400 pages, there's brevity in there. Yeah. And so it's like it's showing the reader the respect that they can make it with a suggestion, that we can suggest them through the world. We can hint them through the world. And I really love the ones who are able to do that with a great deal of economy. That can be really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much so. Very much so. So you came up in a world much like I did, where we were at sort of this cusp between sort of corporate owned comics, right?
Yeah.
And people actually making comics to express themselves, certainly the undergrounds predated both of us by half a decade or a full decade. I mean, the undergrounds were basically all dead by the time I was reading comics.
They were getting close. Yeah, I was starting out in like 74, 75. So yeah,
Yeah.
they were still there, but I associated them more. It was starting to become kind of shtick. It's like, yeah, you could find your fabulous furry freak brothers, but people were hurting. The head shops were being closed.
Yeah. And we're in this world where, you know, there's sort of this idea of ground level comics, which are not underground, you know, they're modern, they're, you know, but they're also not. Finding stores that sell them is always the tricky part, right?
Yeah.
How much do you think that influenced your sort of understanding of the language and the form of comics?
I think, you know, in a lot of ways, I think what we think of as the ground level, it's a little hard to sort of reconstruct that in our memories, because, you know, well, we're talking about things like Star Reach at the beginning, and, you know, like Friedrich, and then of course the small publishers.
That whole kind of course, you know.
Oh, say that last part again. Sorry.
I was going to say American Splendor. I would put in sort of that path, you know, where we could see that there was something else you could do with comics other than telling stories about Archie or telling stories about Batman.
I think in some ways, American Splendor, even though it was very early, I think its true progeny is I associate more with sort of the autobio stuff that was happening around like the Toronto scene and things like that. But also, I feel like he anticipated something that was a little bit later, whereas the world that, and when we mention the ground level stuff, that really is kind of where I start, right? Because if you think of Eclipse Comics and First Comics and Pacific, all that stuff was kind of that ground level. The idea being that, oh, we're not going to do Comics Code. We want to have freedom, but at the same time, we're not necessarily specifically countercultural. We might all, you know, like the people involved in those all had kind of underground sensibilities, but they just wanted to put anything out there, right? Craig Russell wants to do opera comics. Fine, great, awesome. It doesn't all have to be sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? It was just this very eclectic feel. And that was very appealing to me because I was frankly kind of apolitical in those days. And so I wasn't as interested in comics as a rebellion as I was in comics as a blank slate, as an opportunity for just all creative possibilities. And so I saw it's that thing that I bring up in like later in my book, Reinventing Comics, this idea of comics as being this point from which arrows are moving in every direction, right? Which is sometimes hard to pull off. But I saw the business being that way too. And part of that was because as soon as I got to college, starting in 1978, I started to see manga. I got a hold of Fred Schott's book about manga called just Manga, The World of Japanese Comics, I think it was.
Correct. Yep.
And he was talking about the incredible variety of genres. So this to me was like a business revelation. It's like, oh, the industry doesn't have to be this way. We could be making comics for everybody. And that was this sputtering revolution that like keeps starting and stopping instead of starting. Even to this very day, I think some of our potential to reach out, it's hard sometimes, you know, because they're just like earthly concerns. You know, especially when we only had one distributor for a really long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with sort of the mechanical ways in which comics are distributed.
Yeah.
And, you know, as much as I support and love the direct market, you know, I constantly say the reason that stores are what they are is because the person who owned that store wanted a clubhouse that they could hang out in, right?
Yeah.
So the guys who started clubhouses who were really, really big Marvel fans have Marvel clubhouses, right?
Yep.
Whereas the number of people like me or Millionaire Picnic or Comicopia or Rory back in the day at Comic Relief, you know, who cared about the medium of comics rather than the genre or the universe. There's not a lot of us out there, you know, and so it's harder to find the venues that are selling that material and that are putting it out there as viable, as equal as the superhero stuff.
Yeah, it was the front door, side door thing, right?
Yeah,
You know, it's just like who comes in the front door is the people who are already into comics. And that's now that we have, I think of some of our very best ambassadors now here in the 20s. I guess it's not quite the 20s yet, whatever, late teens, 20s, like Raina Telgemeier, where it's just like, yeah, I mean, now it's outreach time. Now it's like we really could be reaching out to the general community. But if you're, like if your customers, if you're someplace where really it's just the superhero fans are sustaining a store, it's that you can't turn on a dime, right? You can't, if it's a real like good old fashioned guy hole, like where it's just like we're just kind of hanging out and like talking about Wolverine's bones or whatever. It's a little hard to put smile in the window, right?
yeah, exactly.
But one of the things that with when the web comes in is you can have much more side door diversification, where you can have a particular subject, a particular genre that can then spawn actual comics. And if those comics can then come back into print, like something like Adventure Zone or whatever,
Sure.
and like create an actual printed thing, then there can be some back and forth there, and it doesn't just have to be this like escape velocity to nowhere for the print
Yeah.
stores.
Yeah.
And it's been we've been limping along for so long trying to find that point where, like Japan,
Yeah.
where you have people coming in from all walks of life, old and young, male, female, all ethnic backgrounds. You're much closer to that
Yeah.
than the little superhero shops, but it's hard to adapt.
Yeah. This last decade, well, 5+ years, not quite a decade probably.
Yeah.
But we've moved on to it used to be when I opened the store in 1989, because our counter is right by the door. You can hear people walking past, and you would hear people walk past and they'd go, "Oh, comics, I still make those?" And now today in 2020, it's like, "Oh, comics, holy crap, let's go in."
Yeah.
It's a real sea change in terms of that the real world recognizes that there's more than just one genre.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
because maybe they had to read Persepolis in high school.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Maybe they started out with scholastic stuff,
Yep.
the middle grade stuff. Maybe they've heard of Sandman,
Yep.
whatever. Maybe they had to read a chapter of my book, and at junior high, some of them did. But but the thing that burns me up is that how is it that somehow Marvel, especially Marvel and DC both, haven't been able to reproduce the experience of a really great superhero movie in print? It's like that confuses me. Why?
Oh, that's easy. That's super easy, because the people who are in charge of Marvel and DC today that's not what their remit is. Their remit is taking the amount of money that they make right now and making 10% more next quarter. That's literally what they're focused on. And there are plenty of wonderful people who are working at Marvel and DC. I don't
Absolutely, yeah.
Speak ill of them, but it's very much they recognize that, if I put another cover on this, I can sell 10% more, and I don't have to do anything artistic or creative to do that.
Does that still? Do you feel that even in 2020 that dynamic is still?
That is Marvel's business model right now, and DC has now switched to that business model, I believe.
It's really sad. Yeah.
The concept that Spider-Man sells well, let's do a second Spider-Man, let's do a fifth Spider. Right now, at this point, there's something like, this was pre-COVID, so things right now are a little different. But pre-COVID, I think we had peaked out at like 22 Spider-Man books in a month.
I think
4 or 5 different Spider-Man comics in a week.
That's
right?
nuts.
The only people who could possibly keep up with that are the total fanatics, right? And it's certainly I think you can think from your experience as a kid, right? Like, it's very easy to get sucked into that world and start going, "Oh, I'm really into this." But then as you age, you just it's too much and you can't keep up with it. So why would you? That's why is
Well,
short.
there's the cost of it. There's the work of keeping up, right? There's
Yeah.
also just the price per minute and
Yep.
the minute by minute
Yep.
experience of it. It's just like, well, I don't know. I could watch the DVD I have of Avengers again.
Exactly.
You know, and it's like that. What Heidi MacDonald long ago called the satisfying chunk.
Check.
That's something that manga understood, and it's one of the reasons that manga was so huge. And it's like, well, I don't know. I feel it. You know, Kurt has this theory. You're probably going to hear it. You know, when you talk to Kurt Busiek, of like that there was a crucial moment where paper prices were going up, and Kurt always talks about this like moment. This was like what, late 50s, something like that.
Yeah.
Paper shortages, and comics had to make a choice. Are they going to raise the price, or are they going to cut pages? And they actually cut pages.
Yeah.
We kept comics short. In fact, they got shorter. It used to be like 48-page like packages and everything.
Yeah.
And I don't know, if you really want to do a paper movie, if you want to give somebody the excitement of a full emotional journey through a story, 200 or 300 pages actually kind of works better.
Right.
And we could have stuck with that. We actually could have been doing that. We could have done exactly what Japan did and serialized them, you know, weekly or bi-weekly, and then put out collections, or we could have had standalone graphic novels. But instead now, because you have that short, I think that there are actual consequences for what happens in the panels when you have to cram it into the short package, because what happens then is you're really anxious about how much they're spending per page. And so you want to slow them down.
Okay.
And the only way to slow them down is to put a lot more words per panel. Okay. And what happens is there's a decoupling of the world of what's happening in the dialogue and the descriptions and what's happening in the pictures, because they have to cover more ground in those chunks of text, right? Otherwise, the whole thing is just going to be flip, 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 and I'm done. And what did I spend a few bucks on, right?
Yeah.
But as a result, there's a decoupling, and the words and the pictures aren't sending the same message. They're not synchronized. One of the things that Raina figured out, and actually you'll find precedents for this going all the way back to like Wendy Peeney in the 70s or whatever, is that emotion is action, first of all. Yeah. And so anytime there's any change of emotional polarity, anytime somebody goes happy to sad or even happy to less happy, whatever, that's its own moment. That has to be a separate moment. You break them down. You have to break down the little moments, because the little moments are what give you that traction, that granularity of experience that make you feel like you're there. You know, like if you go to the first Avengers movie where Captain America, you know, that incredible moment where he says, you know, I understood that reference, right? You know, the Wizard of Oz, the flying monkey reference. You know, like that relies on the rhythms of conversation and everything that led up to it. There were like moments of silence that were required if you want to deliver that moment of humor. You can't have it all. You can't have 2 minutes worth all happen in one giant, like multi-tiered word balloon. Sure. But that sort of thing is necessary, even with the best writers, even with terrific artists. And there are a lot of great writers and great artists in the mainstream. If they have to stuff it into like 20 pages or so, then they've got to fatten up the words. And it's, I don't know, fucks it up.
So there's so much to unpack there. And I want to push back on like 3 or 4 prongs of that. I don't know. So first off, I would say it's interesting that manga is the way that you got to that conversation, because manga natively is 8 to 16 pages is the chunk, right? Yeah. Sure, it's eventually collected in a bigger, fatter book, right? Mm-hmm. But each of the narrative beats that you're getting is an 8 to 16 page chunk. Traditionally in a weekly anthology kind of a comic. I don't know if they're still week. I think the anthologies maybe are like bi-weekly these days. I'm not sure. Stipulated, sure. I'm not sure either. I'm mostly going off Fred's book, Manga. I got
which is a while ago. Yeah,
don't know what's happening.
I should know. I should know that too. I'm behind myself.
Yeah, but you see what I mean? Like, so you're right that ultimately it adds up to something, but the individual, like, so I think about like Lone Wolf and Cub, right? So where a chapter of Lone Wolf and Cub can literally be two people staring at each other and a leaf falling, right? That would be an entire chapter, you know?
Yeah.
Which you don't have
in the original format. In the original format, of course, it's bracketed by other excerpts. Of course. And then either, it's one or the other, right? You're experiencing that short excerpt as part of like short excerpt, like a whole bunch in a book, or you're experiencing it because you are reading the collected. And then, of course, it tells this nice long story. And like, it takes a while for Omar Sharif to make his way across the desert in Lawrence of Arabia. If you had to make one of those comic, like one scene there, nothing would happen at all except like, oh, there's this guy in the distance. There's still this guy in the distance, right? But it's worth it because when you're experiencing it, the whole 2.5-3 hour movie, that waiting is it's delicious. It's wonderful to have that suspense. But where am I going with? I'm totally getting lost in the weeds here. I think you'll find that the pacing in those short 16-page excerpts, they're very leisurely because they know that you're getting the satisfying chunk. The satisfying chunk is to get a piece of this, a piece of that, a piece of this, a piece of that,
right?
Or to have the whole collected thing I'm on volume 17. I'm just ripping through these like a Netflix binge.
The thing that I was going to say is that in a way, there's a difference between the Japanese model of sort of that 8 to 16 page is the serialization, right? Versus the American model where it's 20 to 24 pages, let's say, is that. And it doesn't seem like a big difference between those two segments, but there's actually pretty much a huge difference. And we grew up with a lot of serialized comics in the 70s and the 80s, where the best people who were doing comics, and I would put you among this with Zod as well, would tell a complete story within that 20 to 22 page story that did in fact add up to something else, right?
In fact, I was 18 pages in the later issues, and those were the ones most people liked the most. Yeah, they're very short. And I was thinking of Eisner and the way he would tell a story.
Yeah. And so that cultural difference between those two things, because ultimately I have to say that I think that learning the constraints of the language of comics in a shorter format is probably yields better cartoonists.
I think starting in that realm definitely does. I think I would definitely suggest if a person was just starting out, finish a story. You got to finish. I don't know anyone in my like circle of like artist friends or whatever who wouldn't give that advice. It's like, you got to finish something. You got to finish something. Best way to finish something is to start small. Do a short story, do something in an anthology, do a mini comic, right? You got to finish something. Never start with the 400-page graphic novel.
Right.
A few people have done that and that didn't end well.
That 24-page, 24-hour comic is a different thing.
Yeah.
Your 400-page graphic novel. They have different languages, they have different constraints, they have different narrative structures as well,
Absolutely. Yeah, they do. But I think what I've been seeing, like, and that there are always exceptions, right? But like first of all, take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. Because I'm not reading a lot of superhero comics these days, so it's like I'm being a bit of a knucklehead even by bringing it up, because what I should do is I should be like Flaming Carrot and like spend an entire year and like read every single comic that comes out, and then I can say this stuff with a little bit more confidence. But I will come across these series that are like, I'm going to try this series, and they're good. Again, good series, good, interesting characters, good writers, good artists. But I'm frequently seeing I'm seeing a disconnect between the words and the pictures. I'm seeing perverse incentives to stuff it with more words to slow you down. And one other thing that we haven't talked about yet, which is a kind of compositional dynamic to create a page that is an exciting series of counterpoints, dynamic variation that in many ways renders it sort of something to hang on your wall or to sell at a convention, and isn't always the thing to propel you forward from panel to panel to panel. It's a little page oriented, like about the composition of the whole page. But that's another thing entirely. That's, I don't know, sometimes when I really like Tezuka, the Japanese artist, like who did like 150,000 pages of comics. One of the reasons I like him so much is because when you pick up a Tezuka book, you can close your eyes and just randomly flip to a page and point, and there's always going to be a page that he never did again. He didn't do it before or since. It's unique. He didn't repeat compositions, and I think because a lot of those they felt more like accidents.
Yeah,
and I feel like a lot of post-Kirby artists, and we're talking now about 50, 60 years worth of comics, right? Sure. I think a lot of post-Kirby artists, as soon as they've drawn panel 1, they're already beginning to set down the laws they have to follow in drawing panels 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Absolutely.
Because of that counterpoint thing.
Because I think in at least for Western comics, I think the page is the unit, not the panel.
It often is. It often is. But to me, I don't think that's necessarily central to comics DNA. I think it's more central to that genre and to the way people do it in order to stand out on the rack. And sometimes even to stand out against the ads on the facing pages, if they still do that. Do they do the ads on the facing pages?
But I see the same thing happening in graphic novels.
Well, not with the ads.
not with the ads, but where people are thinking in terms of pages rather than thinking in terms of panels, right? So there's kind of ways.
A lot of people do,
right? Like you can either, and we'll talk about digital in a while, but you can either go sort of panel, or you can go the composition of the page is the most important thing. And graphic novels tend to be compositionally on the page.
I think yes. I mean, you're definitely right that is the way it tends to go. I think what I'm saying is I think comics might be a little bit broken because of it. I think the page might actually be hobbling us a little because experientially, if you do want to create a 300-page satisfying chunk that is as much fun for readers as those Marvel movies are, and let's say you have an equivalent, let's say you want to do an Iron Man graphic novel, for instance. I'm just talking about the superhero world right now, because this is particularly concentrated in superheroes. If you want to do that, the real challenge is not to make every page go, wow, right? Because when the page goes, wow, you're like, wow, I'm looking at a piece of paper, right? It's like a wow piece of paper, but it's still a piece of paper. I think the real challenge is to suck you into the world of the story, and every single panel you experience should make you fall into the next panel.
Correct.
Because you just want to keep turning the page and turning the page and turning the page. And that's actually a slightly different challenge than creating that dynamic counterpoint that makes it an exciting page and an exciting spread. Because often there's a kind of stasis to that. Yeah. It's like if you create a satisfying enough composition, it dies a little. Like the way we walk is we fall. Laurie Anderson has a song where she talks about that. You fall, and then your leg pops out and it stops you from falling. Then you start falling again, and the other leg stops you from falling. I think that's the kind of momentum that can propel us through a story, as if there's a kind of imbalance and almost a kind of blindness to the whole page, but a kind of cascading momentum from panel to panel. And a lot of it has to do with the content of the panels too, obviously. Like what's happening in the panel is always more important than how well it's drawn.
Yeah.
How each panel relates to the next panel, I think, is more important sequentially than it is how it relates to the panel on all sides spatially. It's temporally. How does it propel you forward? And how does each panel encapsulate a moment that feels like it's happening before your eyes? When I was working on The Sculptor, which is not a graphic novel everybody loved, and I'm sympathetic, I think, sometimes to the people who didn't like it more than to the people who did. So I'm not too deluded about it. I think it has some problems. But the one thing it did have, because of the way I actually laid it out, this peculiar method that I had, the one thing it does have is that an incredible number of people told me they read it in one sitting.
Yeah.
They started reading and it kept them reading.
Yeah.
It had that beach read quality.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was because I was agnostic on the pages to a great degree. I discovered the full page compositions almost kind of after the fact, but what I was doing is I did it 40 pages at a time in 20-page, when I was laying it out, in 20-page strings where I would take panels out and put them in as if I was composing scenes in a movie or like I was a film editor, right? And I was just like putting those panels in, taking them out, and making sure that panel to panel to panel to panel had a lot of cohesion, a lot of that it was sticky. And then I would kind of discover the page compositions. And that's what Tezuka did. I think he discovered the page compositions rather than following a formula to create a great page composition. I don't think he didn't even see them to some degree.
Yeah. I understand completely. It's
good because I have no idea what I just said. It was just that was.
No,
I can barely understand myself. That was a really weird rant.
Yeah, no. Because one of the things that happens with these interview series is I'm talking to an awful lot of young cartoonists who are doing their first graphic novel, and an awful lot of young cartoonists who are doing their first graphic novel have never drawn 20 sequential pages ever before, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what's expected of a young cartoonist today, right? Is a 200-page book, which seems insane to me to expect out of someone fresh out of art school. Do you know what I mean? When they haven't figured out necessarily the individual lingua franca to of scene to scene even, and they're expected to create these narratives that are immense in scope. And so this points me back in a way to The Sculptor, because if I had a criticism of The Sculptor, this criticism was that it's 300 some odd pages long, 400 pages, however it is.
It was almost 5 actually.
Really fucking long. Now it's not bad to be long, but it means things go on.
Yeah.
And you're not doing the reductive thing that I think that comics are the best at. Right. And I wonder, so you were talking about how you think that the format works against comics in some ways. And I actually think the opposite is true. I think that the original graphic novel format, that 200-page format, works against comics so much for young cartoonists who have not yet gotten their chops.
Well, yeah, well, it's true. Although I would say those same cartoonists, if they had started out like doing the 20-page pages, I think it would have given them a certain amount of discipline. But at the same time, was it Hemingway who said that the first draft of everything is shit?
Yeah.
I think that, like in many ways, we're all like a first draft. We're walking, talking first drafts for the first like 10 years of our careers anyway. So it's probably that's going to be bad short comics or bad long comics. Huh. But if they're starting in graphic novels, one of the things that's going to happen is that they're going to adopt a language gradually, not right away, but they're going to adopt a language gradually that's adaptable and appropriate for that length, for that format, and they're going to pace themselves based on that. Well, what happens is that if somebody starts out in one and jumps to the other, that's when things fall apart, right? Yeah. And it could be actually that maybe some of the mismatch I'm seeing in the 24-page, 22-page comics are people whose favorite works are graphic novels. Maybe they're trying to do blankets, but they only have 20 pages.
Right.
And that the pacing is wrong. They should be looking at old spirit stories or something.
Yeah.
Um,
do you go to the comic shop on a regular basis? Are you regularly reading comics?
well, I'm regularly getting them, and they pile up because I am so fucking slow as an artist and as a reader that I never get to read enough.
Yeah.
And this is the great tragedy, is like I love comics and I never get to read enough of them. So I keep getting them, but I go, like, you can't see it now because it's like blocked by this bookcase. But back there on the other side of my studio, I got like shelves and shelves and shelves of my to be reads. And I'm not getting to them. And usually the ones that I get to first are the ones that I feel most guilty about, because I promised somebody I would read something or something, and that's not a good reason either.
Sure, they're looking for a blurb.
Yeah, well, yeah, sometimes, but yeah, I want to be a reader again, and I'm not. One good thing about editing Best American Comics back in 2014 is it forced me to read a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
it's more artsy stuff, but I think I want to catch up more on the mainstream, and like I shouldn't even be talking about mainstream comics until I've read a bunch more. But you can't stop me. I just start talking about anything. But
it's weird too, because we're of that generation where you use the term mainstream, and
it's a meaningless term now.
They are not what an average person walking down the street wants.
Yeah, I should say the monthlies.
I can tell you, it's not. This is not. Superhero comics are not a thing anymore. I mean, they're a thing.
Well,
they drive a lot of business, but they're not the thing driving the conversation anymore. They're not the thing driving the medium anymore. And I want to think that a lot of it is due to a book like this. A lot of it is due to things that you and cartoonists of your generation were doing as well. We totally veered into theoretical conversation. So
it's inevitable,
because theoretical conversation is the thing that both of us do. But let's talk a little. I want to go back to some of your career just a little tiny bit, because there's a couple of three things here that I'm really fascinated by. And so we're going to kind of go in timeline order. I just when I went to sort of do the research for the show, obviously I went to your website, which, by the way, you have a great website.
Thanks.
It would be really nice if most cartoonists had a website as nice as that.
It'd be really nice if I updated it more than once every 2 years. Yeah.
But in the history section, one of the things you talk about is, I love this, Biff Bang Pops. A comic that you and Kurt and a couple other people did in 1978 that was for the Boston Pops. That was the first licensed Marvel and DC crossover.
It's true, yeah.
And you were in high school.
We were in high school, yeah.
How? Okay.
It's so crazy what happened. It was actually drawn. I only did layouts. And Kurt did write it. It was actually drawn by a friend of ours named Chris Bing, who's a pretty celebrated children's book author, actually. He's got a very detailed style. He also does work for like the Wall Street Journal, I think.
Okay.
He had a family connection to sort of the Children's Council, or so I forgot what it was, the Youth Council for the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And as a result, they decided to put together this comic. And indeed, we got licensed to have Marvel and DC Comics characters battling it out in Boston, in location. In a lot of ways, it was a lot like the comic Kurt and I were doing that took place in our high school, in our local town, in our local library, where a bunch of superheroes beat the crap out of each other for 60 pages. That one was called the Battle of Lexington. So this is just that, except with Seiji Ozawa, the Boston Symphony Orchestra conductor. And this thing was sold at the opening night in 1976, maybe. I'm not sure.
78 is what it's written.
78, yeah. So it'd be so we were like juniors or seniors in high school by then. Yeah. it was projected on the screen in Boston Symphony Hall, the comic, with local radio personalities reading the characters, which never works, of course, but whatever. It's not their fault. And I also designed 3 murals, like 10, 20-foot murals that were displayed in the lobby and painted by contest winners from like high school art contest winners, and auctioned off and donated to children's hospitals or something like that. It was just totally insane. And Saul Harrison, who was president of DC at the time, sat at our table. It makes no sense. Oh, and as Kurt likes to point out, like they only printed, 1,000 or whatever, and the unsold copies, he said, were burned.
Wow.
So yeah, it's the craziest collector's item. Every once in a while, somebody will offer me, real bucks for my copy, but I can't find it. I don't know if I want to sell it anyway, but it's just the weirdest thing.
Yeah, but this is, that you were high school students and the Boston Pops, which even then was a huge, huge, huge thing.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, we were kids.
I was a New York kid. That's
it
crazy.
was a kid thing. It was a kid thing because it was the youth council that I guess maybe every year they were the ones who did the opening night, and so we were the youths.
Yeah,
I guess.
Okay.
It's all like a strange dream.
Yeah.
I like both Kurt and I think view it as a complete anomaly, having nothing to do with our careers. It didn't get us work.
Okay.
I mean, it's not why I got my job working in production at DC. It's not. I never showed it as a portfolio piece.
I see. Okay.
I'd never showed the murals, I don't think. It was just this weird, crazy thing that happened. But I think we benefited from Lexington, Massachusetts had, it wasn't super rich or anything in those days. It's gotten much more so since then, but it was very brainy. It was very connected. We knew, there are a lot of people who were involved in the cultural scene. So it was just the luck of the draw that we weren't living almost anywhere else.
Yeah.
That we wound up in the middle of this, and there was a family connection with Chris. And so I looked at that and I immediately drew the correct conclusion, which was not that I was fated for greatness or anything, or that Kurt was, but that the world was a morally neutral, unimaginably pointless, random place. And this meant absolutely nothing, which is exactly right, which was exactly the right conclusion. I knew I would have to make my own way, that this would do me no good.
But how did this play into your I want to be a comic artist?
It was already set.
Okay.
I had when I told Kurt at 15 years old, when I said I am going to be a comic book artist, that was it. It was, and I was serenely confident. In fact, my confidence was at a constant 100% until I had success. That's when everything collapsed for me.
That makes sense, actually.
And I was paralyzed for 3 years. And I was completely messed up and had terrible writer's block, and everything fell apart when I finally had success in 93.
Yeah. Okay. So okay. Let's stick with the high school and junior high here for a second, because you're 15 years old. You're like, I am gonna be a comic artist.
Yeah, and that was only 6-7 months after Kurt got me into reading the things.
There's kind of no clear path to becoming a comic artist at that point, as I understand it, right? Mm-hmm. There's not. I guess the Kubert School had started at that point, but you didn't go to the Kubert School. You went into a regular art program.
Yeah, at Syracuse University. I was an illustration major. They didn't have, if they had a comics major, I would have been a comics major, but it was as close as I could get.
But so did any of your teachers, you're like, I want to be a comic artist, did any of them indulge you at all in that fantasy? Or were they like, no, draw a bowl of fruit, goddammit?
No, actually, well, yeah, I did have to draw the bowl of fruit, and I did take a lot. I had a lot of assignments that had nothing to do with that, and I had a couple of like '70s art snob teachers, and then most of my teachers were really cool and accepting, and I was had fun conversations in class. Murray Tinkelman, my illustration teacher, was an absolute gem, a terrific illustrator he had an original Crazy Cat. He was tennis partners with Will Eisner.
Oh,
Other teachers had plenty of respect for comics.
okay.
Um, and
That's
so,
relatively rare at that period of time, though.
say again.
That's relatively rare during that period of time among
It,
academics.
it was. I think if I had gone to Carnegie Mellon, which was my the other one I had my eye on, but they looked kind of grim. I don't
Yeah.
know. Carnegie Mellon seemed grim. Syracuse seemed cheerful. I was a cheerful guy. I went
Yeah.
to Syracuse. But if I'd gone to another school, yeah, I might not have gotten that. Now, if I'd gotten the cold shoulder, if I'd been told comics were junk, if I was told that I was never going to make it, this is a stupid idea, don't do it, I still would have been a comic book artist. I just would have been a different comics artist.
Yeah. Did you consider the Kubert School at all? That would have
I
been
didn't.
time.
I saw it as I got some good advice from like the school counselor. I think he might have known about the Kubert School, and he thought of it as more sort of trade school. I mean, he had a pretty realistic picture of it as like training you to do something very specific.
Yeah.
And even then, by the time I was heading off to college, I had all kinds of artistic pretensions. I might have seen Raw by then. Like I was very highfalutin. Like I had big plans. I was going to do some crazy thing that no one had ever seen before. I just didn't know exactly what.
Yeah. So how did you end up at DC in '83? Maybe but
pure accident.
okay.
Yeah, what happened was I'm trying to C.W. Pike was this tall really cool lady who taught design in my senior year. And I believe I have a theory that she's the model for C.J. Craig, the press secretary in The West Wing, played by Allison Janney.
Yep.
Because, of course, Sorkin went to Syracuse.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he was just a year behind us, I think. But I really feel like she was the model for CJ. Anyway, for CW, whatever. Anyway, getting off track. So she gave us an assignment to make a resume. It's like, okay, we're going to do a design a resume thing. And as part of the assignment, we had to send it to a prospective employer. I sent it to DC. 3 weeks before college ended, I got a phone call. I got woken up by a phone call from Bob Brzakis at DC Production, because I had sent off this thing saying, hey, I did all this stuff. And I said, hey, you guys, the DC explosion or whatever, you guys are going to be looking for production people or whatever. I just thought, hey, I could do that. I knew how to cut Ruby Lith, right? I knew how to set type. I could do whatever. And I said, well, yeah, you want to come down for an interview like on Monday? And I'm like, okay. So I'm like in Syracuse, right? I have to make it down to Manhattan. I go down there and I kind of get the job. I'm staying with my uncle who's in Croton-on-Hudson, up the Hudson line, up the Hudson River, basically. Staying with him. And I didn't know what to do when they offered me, what was it, like I think it was $215 a week. And because I thought you're supposed to say, that's thank you for the offer, I'll think about it. I thought that's what you're supposed to do. So I said that, and which was dumb because of course I wanted the job. But I thought you were supposed to do that. So the next day I called back, and now the offer is $225.
Wow.
So I had accidentally negotiated myself an extra $10 a week. It was more money in those days. This is
absolutely
82.
Yeah.
So like there it is. I have a job. It's 3 weeks before the end of school. I still got to finish school and graduate, and now I'm living in Manhattan and working at DC.
Yeah.
And I have a very intense couple of years working at DC. But what happened was 3 weeks after I get there, my dad dies. I get a phone call from my mom. It was the same day I met Will Eisner. I've gone up to his house in White Plains, welcomed me in. It's very sweet. Looks through my portfolio. We have, we talk about this and that and this and that. Gives me lots of great advice. I come home, my dad died that day. My mom tells me after the fact in the morning. And for those first 3 weeks, I've seen the way it is. You have to take your time. Maybe you spend a couple of years correcting other people's lettering. Maybe you get to letter. Maybe you get to ink. Maybe in 10 years, you're going to get to do this and that. Maybe you can ink backgrounds. And maybe in 20 years, you can have your own book. I've had about 3 weeks of getting that drilled into my head. My dad dies, and I'm like, no, I don't want to wait. So I had this sketchbook with ideas. And I tell Bob Razakis, Bob, I think I'm not going to be doing overtime if that's all right. Here's why. My dad just died. I want to make a proposal. I want to make my own comics, and that's what I did. And I over the next few months or whatever, I just worked really hard on weekends and after work, and I did a 100-page proposal for Zod, my first comic. Just because it was the thing on the top page of my sketchbook was that.
Right.
And I sent it out to a bunch of publishers, showed it to DC first, and showed it to Epic, Dick Giordano at Marvel.
Yeah.
I got a lot of good reactions, and I got some offers from the independent, publishers, but I wanted to own the thing, and DC didn't do that.
Yeah.
So even though there's a possibility I might have been able to do that, it's just like, no, that wasn't going to happen. So I'm sorry, it's Archie. I mixed that up. Sorry, it was Dick Giordano at DC. It's Archie Goodwin at Epic.
Yeah, I knew what you meant. Let me just ask that question there. You knew in 1983 that you needed to own it.
83. Yeah, 83. Yeah. I think Miller had been talking about creators' rights. I think that Dave Sim was out there making noise.
But you were working at DC.
I was working at DC. Yeah, well, I got a job. I mean, it was a job. I just got a job. It was in comics. It was a job.
Yeah.
It's paying the bills. But and it was starting to work its spell on me, right? I was starting to think in terms of, what's it like to have a job inside of the mainstream, right? But I've been reading ElfQuest. I've been reading Cerebus. I've been looking at the Spirit. I've been there were a lot of different potential models out there. And this was at the time when Eclipse Comics, First Comics, Pacific Comics, Star Reach, all that stuff had been going on, right? And there was this idea of, you can own it yourself. Maybe you don't get paid so much, but if they make a movie, we were starting to figure that out. And so I said to Dick Giordano, it was DC actually, when he asked me, and I said, yeah, but I would need to have creative control and own it. And he's like, yeah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But he was very sweet. I mean, they were all wonderful people. Archie Goodwin was an absolute doll and gave me terrific advice. He turned me down, but it was one of the nicest rejections I could have possibly gotten.
Yeah, theoretically, Archie he's doing Epic at that point, right?
He was doing Epic Illustrated, and the Epic line was beginning at that point.
Kept the rights to your work, theoretically.
Not really.
No,
not really. If he had said yes, no, the Epic deal after the fact, we sort of gradually came to understand that the Epic deal had a lot of, they had a lot of hooks in you, even.
Right. I just, I think that the only non-Aardvark Vanaheim Cerebus was published at Epic.
That might be, yeah.
Right? I mean, so,
I would have to go, I have to go back. It's possible that I'm not giving them their due. It could be that Epic had a more generous, contract language and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I know that Veitch kept underlying control of most of his work, and most of the people that I can think of kept their work ultimately.
Yeah, well, that may have been Archie's influence. In fact, it could be, or maybe they just had a more enlightened, view of such things. Yeah. Not that Dick Giordano wasn't enlightened. It's just, you know what? I just realized I never plugged in my laptop. That could have been embarrassing. Hold on.
No problem. I kind of want to talk about this 80s period where there's clearly this new golden age that's happening of people expressing themselves and owning their work and doing these things, and yet the business is almost completely controlled by these giant legacy corporations. I mean, this is pre-Image.
Yep.
Certainly, Eclipse and Pacific and companies like that are trying to do creator-owned stuff, but nothing has broken through in the way, you know, that we understand it today. You know,
Right. The Turtles hadn't happened, for one thing.
The Turtles haven't happened yet. Yeah. So what was your, as an aspiring creator wanting to do your own things, how did you see the landscape at that point? I you know, that was a really long time ago. Maybe you can't answer that question fully. I fully understand.
It was all potential. Like, to me, it's just like, comics was still a blank slate to me. I still saw it as like, there's all these things we could be doing that we weren't doing yet. And again, like, by the time 82 rolls around, I mean, like, I'm like, my friend Adam Phillips is going to SVA, and because even while I'm at DC, we had to move the offices across the street to 666 Fifth Avenue, the Devil building that Jared Kushner owns now. At some point we had to move it. And because of that, we got a day and a half off. And I actually used it as 3 half days to hang out at SVA with my friend Adam and sit in on classes with Will Eisner and Art Spiegelman. So like, I'm already like, I'm enthralled to like the raw world. Okay. Like, so there's, but all of it, I'm not a partisan, right? It's not like, no, I'm a new wave cartoonist. It's like, no. It's like, I was fascinated by that stuff. I was looking at Theodore Deathhead, you know, like by Pascal Dory on the one hand, and I was like really into Amethyst, you know, like by Ernie Cologne.
Yeah.
Like all of it. It was the variety of it. It was all the possibilities of it. Because there were so many possibilities. In fact, a lot of ways, when I looked at the direct market, sort of the mainstays, the middle ground stuff, it bothered me that they were all superhero parodies. And it bothered me that mine was a superhero. Parody isn't the right word, but that mine was this sort of pastiche superhero, postmodern superhero, whatever it was. Because I was like, I didn't really think I was going to do that. I had these illusions that I was somehow immune, and I was going to go off and, you know, be more like the Hernandez brothers or something. But I wasn't that cool. You know, I was always a little retrograde, a little old fashioned that way. But it was never, I just kind of like stumbled back into being the kind of middle ground, middle of the road guy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wouldn't call it middle of the road though. I would call it classical, I guess. I don't know. Here's Zot here. I've got it in front of me. I think this work still holds up today, which I don't know that you would necessarily say that with everything that, say, Raw was publishing at the time. You know,
I'm fond of Zot, and you know, there are a lot of parts of it. At the very beginning, I was very, very raw. The later issues, I think, do have a lot going on. I mean, like I was reading stuff like Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio and stuff. I was trying to do little short stories. And like you were saying, I was trying to do it in like 18 pages and seeing what I could squeeze out of it. Yeah. But every time I look at Zot, I look at somebody struggling to do something. I see myself falling short of it in a lot of ways. And a real kind of identity crisis, not quite knowing who I am as an artist yet, or what kind of stories I want to tell. And the superhero elements were maybe more uncomfortably commingling with the other stuff. And I was also discovering that I'm just slow. And so I would have 100 different things I wanted to do, and I was still working on the first one, you know? In fact, the most extreme version of that was when I began that last series of stories, what we call the Earth stories, which are the ones a lot of people like the best in that series. I had just started them. I was like on the second issue. And I realized, I can still vividly remember lying in bed at night, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. And I just realized all at once that I had to do what I was calling the book. I had to do the book. and Ivy can, my wife Ivy, who I was already married by then, she can tell you I was just like a wreck because I realized, no, I have to do the book about comics, this
Yeah.
book that I'd had in mind for a while. It was project number 67 or whatever, like all these things I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I just imagined myself doing a million different things. And the great curse was I was just too damned slow. It took me
Yeah.
forever to do everything. And so when I was working on those last several Zot stories, even though a lot of people like those stories the best, it was torture for me because I couldn't wait to make what became Understanding Comics.
So, as a working cartoonist in the early '80s, was this a living for you?
Sometime at the very beginning, Zot started, like I was getting a certain amount. We were selling like 28,000 copies or whatever at the very beginning, and then it went down and down, and then we had to give up on the color issues, and then I came back in black and white. It was
Yeah.
kind of in the middle of the black and white, revolution. And it's like, oh, hey, we're doing okay. This is doing okay, and then the numbers went down and down and down and down,
Mm-hmm.
and by the end, it was just like, yeah, not enough people buying it.
Yeah.
And it was always a very slow decline. It was not, but I was never a hit. I was never a collector's item. People weren't selling, issue number 1 for $900 or whatever. And I certainly wasn't the Turtles. I was never a sensation. I was just that odd little book off to the side telling quiet stories. And and it was the neither fish nor fowl thing, right? If you were really looking for adventurous or, artistically adventurous black and white comics, go to Fantagraphics, I wasn't doing 8 Ball. I wasn't doing Love and Rockets. I was doing some superhero book. But if you wanted a superhero book, well, there were superhero books that were more superhero-y,
Yeah.
that didn't have long scenes of high schoolers sitting in a Burger King in the rain talking about relationships. It
Yeah.
was,
Well, I mean,
it was
it's as much a
confusing.
romance as anything else. It's
Yeah.
which is one of the things that I think stands out about it and holds up for the day. Your level of craft on the book is certainly pretty immaculate, I think. You
You're
probably
very sweet.
you probably disagree many years later, but I mean, when I look at this book today, this looks very contemporary to me in many ways.
Well, now I have to say I did do something that Will did with the spirits. The dirty little secret is when we put out that collection you're looking at right now, I did go back and fix some of the most embarrassing panels.
Right. Sure.
And I talk about that in the introduction to the book. It's just like, yeah, there are things that just it physically pained me to look at some of those. But even so, I think even with the fixes, my figure drawing was always a little stiff. It always feels a little wooden to me. I don't have the gift. I don't. There are some people who just like Jaime who are just they just lay down a pen and it just sings. And for me,
Yeah.
drawing people, drawing anything, it's work. It's work. I have to work at it. And I have to, I draw a bad picture and then I draw over it until it's an okay picture and then draw again until it's, I just have to keep working it up until it's okay, until it's not so bad. And there are other people who can get it right the first time, every time. They're naturals. And I've never been a natural.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I got to say, your line work, the cross hatching, the level of detail. I mean, I think it's all pretty fantastic.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I do.
And how did this, or did it, prepare you for understanding comics?
In a lot of ways, if you look back, once you've read Understanding Comics, you can see I'm actually doing a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
I was one of the first people to embark on some of the manga things, the things that I found interesting in manga, which weren't necessarily the other things that people were interested in, especially what I think of as the "you are here" techniques, all the different ways that they make the reader feel as if they're participants in the story. I tried to do that in Zot. In my own clumsy way. So I was one of the first ones who was doing a lot of what I call subjective motion, where instead of you watching somebody move across like Superman flying across the sky or whatever, Instead, you're alongside the moving character, and the whole background is streaked behind you, because that makes it feel like you are the moving person. You're in the rocket ship, you're in the bicycle, driving down the path, you're in the speeding car, whatever. That's, to me, that's much more interesting than just watching, oh, here's a drawing of a car with some speed lines behind it. Just like, fuck that. I don't want to be the guy on the sidewalk watching the car go past me. I want to be in the car watching the entire city go past me.
Yeah.
That's one of the things they were doing in Japanese comics. But what I found was that, like, for about 10 or 12 other techniques in Japanese comics, as different as they all were, all these expressionistic emotional effects, all these different ways of cutting from scene to scene, from moment to moment, from aspect to aspect, all that stuff, all of it created that same sensation. All of it made you feel like a participant. That was the thing that bound all of those comics together. That's what I tried to do in Zot. Didn't always succeed, but I tried to get across that sense of participation in Zot. So when I'm writing about that and understanding comics, then you can go back. You can go back to Zot, and you can see it was like, oh, okay, he was already trying to do that stuff. But a lot of the other things in understanding, it was just the invisible stuff about, like, iconography or the way we process images or whatever, stuff that you wouldn't know from reading Zod, but that, of course, it applies to Zod. It applies to all comics.
Yeah. So you were thinking about understanding at that point.
I was thinking about it for years before I did that book.
You couldn't go to sleep with thoughts of it.
Yeah, it was driving me nuts.
Yeah. So what was the process to narrow that into a pitch that someone could understand, if you see what I'm saying, right? Because if you said to me, I want to write a book about how comics work, I would have said to you, you're insane. That's too broad of a topic. What the fuck are you talking about?
Well, fortunately, it was an anything goes time, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, the market wasn't super overcrowded yet. It was beginning to get overcrowded. And there was the black and white glut and all. But the thing that really made it easy was, let's face it, Kevin Eastman.
Yeah.
Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird were like, there was just an avalanche of money, like, pouring down on these guys. And they were very sweet kids. They each had different ideas of what to do with it all. But Kevin thought, well, I'll start a publisher. And his publisher, Tundra, it fell on hard times. And a lot of the people who got involved didn't necessarily make it easy for Kevin. But Kevin's attitude was just like, hey, my friends want to make comics, I can help them. So, I arrive and he's like, Pierre, you should have a pile of money. And I'm like, no, hang on. I should only get the money if I do the pages, let's come up with something that seems fair. And I was very happy that was a book that earned out for him, that, like, I made back the investment. But Tundra didn't last very long. And actually Tundra, Kevin sort of quote unquote sold Tundra to Dennis Kitchen. Sure. So it became, by the time the Understanding Comics came out, because Kevin published Understanding Comics, it was actually not a Tundra book. It was a kitchen sink book. Yeah. Which is really funny. And you have the original edition where it says Tundra right on the spine.
Sure does.
But one of the greatest things is that if you find the original kitchen sink, the very first kitchen sink edition, which is right after that, you go to page 21, I think it is, where I'm talking about iconography and I talk about this is not a pipe, right? The Magritte painting. Yeah. And I'm saying, like, oh, like, these are pictures. They're not the thing, right? So I have a picture of a cow and it says, this is not a cow. And I have a picture of a man and it says, this is not a man. And then I have a picture of the Tundra logo and it says, this is not a company.
Not a company. Yeah.
It's like, oh, man.
So let's talk about Tundra a little bit, because sure. I mean, to me, it's Apple Core, right?
It was actually a lot like, I think from what I understand, it was a little like what happened with the music publishing thing. You're talking about the music publishing thing. Correct. To come out of the Beatles.
Yeah. So we've got so much money. We want to help other people also make art. Let's throw money at them. And it doesn't work. That's not
Well,
the
there
way.
were it doesn't work just like that, obviously. And there were some people who frankly took advantage, of Kevin, and maybe not deliberately, maybe they didn't mean to, but it just kind of worked out that way, and it's sad. But and there were other people who got involved, and like there's family, whatever, but like just stuff. I mean, if you're doing a company for the first time, if you just never done anything like that before, it's just human nature that you're going to make some mistakes. And there were some incentives for people maybe not to give him the best advice or whatever. And I probably gave him advice that I was probably a dummy in some ways too. I mean, we were kids. We were just trying to figure stuff out.
Sure.
But somehow what came out of it was I just sat and drew every day on this book. So like my personal experience of it was that Kevin made it possible for me to do a 200-page book while not starving, right? Because in those days you would get the money like for the little tiny chunks. How you can't work a year and a half without anything getting published. How are you going to make back the money? Well, Kevin could do that. He had the ability to do that. So he was able to subsidize it. And he believed that, I think the book will do well. And it actually did. It actually did make back that money, even if in the end it was Kitchen Sink Press that got the money. But that time sitting and working on that book, it's one of the happiest times of our lives, because it coincided. A lot of things came together all at once. We're living in Amherst, right nearby where Tundra was based in Northampton. This is in Massachusetts. And we had just conceived our first daughter, Sky. And I worked on that book while Ivy was working on, her pregnancy was progressing. She would sit in my old green Naugahyde swivel chair and read to me from What to Expect While You're Expecting or whatever, or your pregnancy week by week, and while I'm drawing panels. And it was just such a really cool time working on the book, working on the kid. I sometimes mix up their release dates, but they came out about 2 weeks apart. But that was after 4 years of trying to get pregnant, so it was a very, very big deal that we succeeded, because we were worried we might never have a kid. I was worried I might never do the book. Well, we had both came out around the same time, and our life was just completely and utterly changed. We became parents. I had a book that actually people cared about, that kept selling. I started traveling for the first time, and at the exact same time, I became completely obsessed by computers and the internet and all that stuff.
Yeah. So, we'll get to that in a second.
You don't have to, because I understand you
No,
can leave the internet
I
completely
really
off the
I
table.
really want to talk about digital comics, like more than anybody. I want to talk to you about digital comics. But
Okay, sure.
let's talk about the challenge of putting together this and of figuring out what gets added and what gets subtracted, and because again, it's a mountain that you're trying to scale. Did you even know that you could get to the top of the mountain?
Remember, this is the key. Scott's confidence was at 100% all the way through this. I knew I could do it. I didn't know that I could make a living. That's why Kevin was so important, right? But I knew I could do it. It's only when I succeeded, it's only when it became a hit, that my confidence crashed.
Right.
But up until the moment I delivered that last page, I had absolute certainty that I could do it. And one of the things that I did was I got a bunch of my friends to be what I called my kibitzers. It's an old chess term, an old Yiddish term. The people who will comment on every little thing. And these were people, Neil Gaiman, Kurt Busiek, most of all, of course. Neil, Steve Bissett, Larry Marder, Ivy was one of them. My old friend Jen Manley Lee. They all told me when my stuff sucked. I started with the assumption that the first draft was shit, and of course it was. And so they would tell me, this stinks, this stinks, this stinks, and I would taking out things left and right. I have whole piles of destroyed panels where I cut them out with scissors and like pasted them in and like rearranged things. And in fact, Neil and Steve especially, and Kurt, they talked me out of killing an entire chapter.
Yeah.
I had a chapter where all of the different art forms sit around a table and argue about what their strengths and weaknesses were. I know it was fucking terrible. It was an awful chapter.
Boy, that sounds awful.
Yeah, but I was the happy warrior, right? Like because I had 100% confidence. It also meant that I wasn't touchy about that stuff.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, I just laugh and say, yeah, you're right. It really sucks, doesn't it? And so we would kill it. We would just kill things left and right. I had no problem killing my darlings. And they also said, oh, and you need a chapter about writing. So that's why I created a chapter on words and pictures.
Yeah.
Still not writing exactly, but close enough.
One of the things that I think that you did that I think is the spine of the book in many ways is that sort of that pyramid of cartoony to realistic, the whole because I had never thought about comics in those like how it fits on a graph, right? So where did that come from? Sort of that analyzation of here's where it is on a plane.
It actually started on the bottom axis. I remember even in college, I was trying to work out, oh, okay, all right, so there's this thing going on. First I was starting from the conviction that there was something very special going on when you had a cartoony image. So the first question is, okay, why is that? And so I started to develop all these theories. But then I'm thinking, okay, well, what's the difference between the cartoony image on this side and the realistic image, the photographic image on this side? Okay, well, if this is really weird because I'm like mirrored reversed as I'm looking at myself here. So it's the left and the right is reversed. Anyway, but okay, if I'm looking at the properties of the cartoony one, I'm looking at the properties of the realistic one. I know, well, there are styles in between that. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's a continuum. Right. Of course there is. There's a continuum. And then eventually I realized that the cartoony end isn't the end of the line because what's happening is you're taking away resemblance, but you're retaining meaning. And what happens is if you do that all the way, you get to words, because that's what words do. Right. Words no longer have any resemblance at all to the thing, but they still retain the meaning. Right. So, okay, so that's a line. But then it's like there's this other ingredient, which is things that are neither representative in what you might call a retinal way or representative in what you might call a conceptual way. Well, what are those? What are the lines and the shapes and the things that are entirely a property of the picture itself that don't fit into any of that? Oh, that's another axis, isn't it? And that's how you get the top point. And now all of a sudden you have 3 points. You have the picture plane on the top. You have the cartoony axis of meaning down here on one corner, and then I have to go the other way. And then you have the realistic one, which represents what the eye sees. So what the eye sees, what the mind perceives, and what's actually there it is on the page. And I realized, oh my God, the entire world of graphic art is contained within that triangle.
Yeah. 27 years later, do you still find that framework to be correct?
Well, a guy named George Bach said all models are wrong, but some are more useful than others. And I think this falls into that category. It's not comprehensive. There's a lot it doesn't take into account, such as artist intention, right? And there's no perfect way to decide where somebody sits on the triangle. But like all models, it is flawed, but it's a useful, what Seymour Papert, I think, calls a tool for thinking. It's a tool for thinking. It's a filter that you can use to look at things. And there are different statements that you can confidently make. Once you have this scheme, you can say something like, oh, because this is rising up the picture plane a little, we're more aware of it as a picture. Oh, because this thing is more cartoony, there's more participation. Oh, because this thing is more realistic, it's more othering. We were more likely to look at it as the other. And then, of course, I started applying it to manga and stuff like that.
Yeah. Do these things work in any other medium? Is there any other medium that these things are true?
Well, the triangle thing is just any kind of visual art. It's true.
Yeah.
Like the things, those that was an observation about just the nature of imagery. So yeah, in fact, it turned out to have applications in other media. Will Wright talks about chapter 2 of Understanding Comics as being an influence on designing things like The Sims. It's like that whole idea, even right down to the blah, 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 like the weird dialogue that comes out of the mouth.
Yeah.
Because in fact, I think of the entire field of video games as the chapter 2 field, right? I know if a video game guy is going to talk to me about understanding comics, it's always going to be about chapter 2.
Right.
Filmmakers often talk about making comics, actually.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I mean, like, it's the big thing about understanding. One of the things that turned out to be most important was, even though it was entirely about comics, it turned out to be about a lot of things other than comics.
Sure.
And that was a principle that I've seen in other works, is that if you drill down deep enough into any subject with enough intensity, then what happens is it's like drilling down the Earth's crust, right? Deeper and deeper and deeper. The further you go down, the more you're sort of like fanning out and connecting with things that cover the surface of the globe. Right? They think of it as sort of a cone that widens the further down you go. And that's why people like Donald Norman or Edward Tufte are people who write about entirely different things, like information graphics or industrial design or whatever. The ones who are most focused on their subject, the most intensely focused on this one tiny thing, they're the ones who wind up writing about everything.
Yeah.
Because you have to ask why. Like a 10-year-old boy, you have to say, but why? But why? But why is this? Okay, well, this is because of that. Oh, yeah? Well, why is that? Well, why is that? Well, why is that? Every time you ask why, you're going a little bit further down into the mysteries of how we communicate.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you naturally widen the focus.
Yeah. 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 No, that makes a lot of sense to me. How long did it take you from start to finish to do the book?
15 months, and I've never done anything that fast ever since. It just came out of me.
Yeah.
Frank Miller said he inhaled understanding comics. In a lot of ways, I exhaled understanding comics.
Yeah.
Right? It was so like in me, I was just like, boom, and there it was. It was just it was a very natural way to go. And the cartooning in it, which is just, it looks like I drew it with my thumb in a lot of ways, but there's nothing I would change. There's nothing. No, it's okay. No, it's all right. I'm not fishing for compliments. What I'm saying is,
I'm not going to compliment for no reason, but I fundamentally fucking disagree with you, dude.
Okay, I appreciate that.
It would not work if it wasn't for the cartooning. I don't know.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, it's good. I actually like it as cartooning. I like it as cartooning because the casual, like, drew it once, like I'm like Ed Wood just shouting cut at the end of every scene, right? It's fine. It's good. Move on. Because the idea was there. It almost didn't matter what the little guy. I mean, objectively, you can look and you can see my character. The head size changes. Sometimes I'm like giant head guy. Sometimes I'm little head guy. Sometimes I'm just like, it's not really even consistent. I'm just like slapping it out, and it doesn't matter because it I don't know. It came from the heart. It came just very organically, and so it works as cartooning. And in a lot of ways, I've never been that just natural in my art ever since then.
Yeah. Did the success of the book work against your ability to be that free?
Yeah. No, it fucked me up.
Yeah.
I had a lot of trouble. I mean, I just had a kid. I was obsessed with computers suddenly, like all at once. My entire world became digital comics immediately. Right. And this is 1993, before anything had fucking happened.
Yeah.
92 even. It was the end of 92 when I actually finished the book, even though it didn't come out for a year.
Yeah.
And I just had kids. suddenly I'm traveling, so I have all of these distractions, right? I'm doing press, I'm traveling, I'm talking to people. Everybody is telling me, Scott, here's something else you should be interested in. And I'm already interested in too many things. Kurt once said, everything is too important to you, Scott. And I said, thanks. I'm taking that as a compliment. And Kurt has always been pissed off at me for taking it as a compliment. He meant it as a criticism, damn it. Everything is too important to me. So when all of a sudden I had all these opportunities and now I have 10 times as many opportunities, I didn't know which one to do.
Yeah.
And so for years I can't get a book together. I want to do this crazy computer generated thing about Abraham Lincoln, but first I have to spend 3 years learning how to 3D model. And it's just a complete disaster because it's just like I can't even think. And by the time I do Reinventing Comics a few years after that, that book has already been up in my head for so long that it's kind of curdled a bit, like it's just like it's sat too long in the fridge and it's a bit stiff, and there's too many panels of me just standing there announcing like 10 lines of dialogue about all these theories, and I'm standing in front of a backdrop of some diagram, and it's just not working because it's been sitting too long in my head.
Yeah.
So eventually I got past that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I see that. It fascinates me really. That, I mean, this book is such a, it's kind of such a fundamental text in a way that, I mean, it's taught in colleges, man. That's got to fuck your head up, right?
Yeah.
Like,
well, I'm okay with that because I just love I love to talk to students about the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it wasn't the success of the book that fucked me up. It was all the things I could do next that fucked me up. It was all the opportunities because all of a sudden I'm facing down my mortality. Because I realize, Scott, you're slow. You're never, ever, ever going to do all these things.
But you did this in 15 months.
I know. And then I also did the 24-hour comic. I did the 24-hour comic.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's always a chance. Now, I always had Will Eisner in the back of my head, right? When Will Eisner was my age, he had done Contract with God.
Yeah.
Just done Contract with God. And he had 26 more graphic novels to do.
Right.
So there is a chance that at a certain point, I'm just going to kick back and relax and just like, oh, you know what? Fuck it. I'm just going to, you know what? I'm going to spend a few weeks and do this little thing over here and do this thing and do this thing. Maybe I'll just start doing them all. Maybe I will do them all.
Yeah.
Maybe I can relax. I don't know.
Yeah. So it seems to me if you turned this out in 15 months and it went through multiple revisions with multiple people.
In the layouts, I did all the layouts. I lay out the books completely before I draw a single page.
Sure, but understood. But that still suggests to me that you're probably some days doing 4, 5, 6 pages a day. Yeah.
Well, let's see. 15 months, so we're looking at like almost 500 days, right?
Yeah.
So the book is 215 pages.
Right.
So if you average it out, right, then it's actually a couple of days a page.
Okay. But not if you're redrawing it and rethinking.
No, but I wasn't redrawing the finished art. That's very important.
But even the layouts to go. Layouts. Oh, I haven't expressed this idea clearly enough.
Yeah.
I've got to figure out a way to express it clearly. These are not trivial tasks.
But I was 33, and quite possibly I was as sharp as I'll ever be at 33. There was a lot of things I didn't know. There were a lot of things I was naive about, but I was fast on my feet.
Yeah.
And so when Neil or Larry or somebody would say, this sucks and here's why it sucks, almost instantly I would say, oh yeah, it has to be this other thing. And I would just go, boom. And I would just like, I knew what I had to do. I just knew. And the other thing is when I discovered it, I had a little of the Picasso thing that you start with a vague idea and then you discover in the process. So in other words, it wasn't that I had to find just the right thing. It was more that once I started drawing it, I was like, oh yeah, I think I know what to do next. Oh, hey, here's an idea. I was like creating theories on the fly. I think the 6 steps the 6 steps predates the book, but a lot of the stuff in the words and pictures chapter, that just came to me because I was doing the words and pictures chapter. I was starting to think about like, oh, okay, well, oh, yeah, the Codex Natal, this pre-Columbian picture manuscript, those are words. Oh, look at that. Hey, it looks like a picture. It's really words. Oh, that's true of Egyptian hieroglyphics too. Oh, look at how, East Asian writing evolved. They evolved from pictures. Oh, that's a lot like the way that the sweat beads evolve and they start out on the forehead and they're flying. That's stuff I was coming up with that on the fly, you know? So it's just like, I have to draw a couple of pages to get today. I guess I have to come up with some more theories. It actually got to that point.
Yeah. Well, but not merely that you're doing theories, but you're also doing it as a comic. That to me is the part about this book that it's the part I don't understand. I understand how you come up with a theory, right? I don't understand how you come up with a theory and then execute it as a piece of cartooning, right? Because that's some fourth dimensional shit to me.
But I was a formalist, right? So I had to, first of all, there was no choice. It had to be a comic because otherwise I'm not putting my money where my mouth is, right? Otherwise I'm a hypocrite. Because if I'm talking about how comics can do anything and I can't do it in comics, well, screw that guy. Right. So it had to be comics. And of course, like Will Eisner probably would have done it himself if he thought of it. He was like, Will's reaction when he saw it, he really liked the book, but part of his reaction was just like, why didn't I do that? He should have done that. Right. But comics and sequential art, it was repurposed from another medium. But it had to be visual. And that was where I felt most comfortable, was working visually. I really felt comfortable. And the other thing is, that when you're visualizing it, when you're making visual all of these ideas, that's also giving you the mental tools to produce the next idea, because it's all so much clearer what needs to happen, because you're educating yourself as you go. As you make this stuff visual, it's just so much easier to clearly imagine where this stuff is all leading than if you have it written out. I've never written a script for myself. I've never typed out a script for myself. I don't do that. It's always like Eisner and Spiegelman and a bunch of other people, Archie Goodwin even. I always work out the story in the form of pictures. So like the very first time I write the dialogue in a word balloon, that's attached to it's already pointing to a face, right? Yeah. It's already in pictorial form. It's the only way I can compose a page. I don't understand people who type out like a movie script for themselves. It's so weird. It's very alien.
I get that. How detailed and tight are your thumbnails? Are they?
They're pretty tight. They look a lot like, if you squint, they look a lot like the actual comic.
Okay.
It's one of the reasons the finished art can sometimes be stiff, is because I've already drawn this thing 5 or 6 times.
Right.
But I have to. I did that with Sculptor, and I did like 4 drafts of a 500-page graphic novel before I drew a single page. Took 2 years. It was 2 years on the layouts, 3 years on the finish.
Wow.
But it is 500 pages, so
That's fully fucking insane. Sorry. That's
It is.
Yeah.
It's completely crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But here's the thing, Brian, I have to read it before I draw it.
Sure.
Because how else do I know if it's worth drawing if I haven't read it yet? I have to read it 5 or 6 times. If it works as a reader, then I know it's good. I gotta hear the melody before I can play it on the instrument, Yeah,
no, that makes sense to me. I remember you giving me a copy of this publication at San Diego, 92, I guess.
Yeah, it would have been. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And just being struck by it, and I felt stupid after reading it because I couldn't add anything. I couldn't go, oh no, this isn't right. Or like today I probably could, I could probably go, oh, actually I think, now, but I was 22 or something, and like, wow, this is not, I can't. Yeah. Wow, you're a fucking genius, dude. I wish I thought of this shit.
That's how I felt actually when I saw the blow ups of blankets, when Craig Thompson had blankets as like blown up like original size Xeroxes that you could page through at a convention.
Yeah.
I remember seeing that massive pile, and I was just like, yeah, he's blown so far past me.
Yeah.
I could never do that.
Yeah. Well, but nobody else could do this, so I think it all evens out, man. That's what I think. Jordan tells me we have a question that he wants me to ask.
Oh, awesome.
So Jordan, put it up. Podrigo, he always asks the best questions. What's the biggest lesson in comics you've learned since writing Understanding Comics?
Let's see. I've learned a whole lot of things since then. I think probably the biggest thing was since writing Understanding Comics, as I think I mentioned earlier, that right as I was finishing Understanding Comics, I became like intensely obsessed with computers, with computer generated art, and with creating comics for digital spaces like the internet. And one of the things that I discovered right away was that comics were working within a constraint that had been invisible to me since then, and that the page box that you and I talked about, Brian, and like I'm more down on the page in some ways than you are, and in fact I think than a lot of people, but I was starting to see the page for the first time. Even when I did Understanding Comics, I don't think I was truly seeing the page for what it is. And it is a fixed rhythm, enforced break that does not always serve the melody. And that's the thing that I think one of the most important things I've learned since then. And working through that, working past that, or working within that is the thing that I'm most, since Understanding Comics, that I've most had to contend with.
Interesting. Okay, I can see that. Jordan, is there another one, or here it comes? It's all good. Andrew and Telis, what are your thoughts on how comics have changed since the book's release? Thinking mostly of the rise of less iconic, more realistic digital art and the increase of moment-to-moment transitions.
Yeah, I think that the rise of realistic stuff, I mean, there's a way to do it right. I mean, there's some really fascinating possibilities if you're working in like the more highly rendered space. So I sometimes get cast as the guy who thinks that, oh no, cartoony art is always better. It's not always true. A lot of my favorites are still like in the cartoony realm, but I think there's a legitimate place for that. Is there some stuff that's like digitally rendered that's over rendered? Yeah, always. I think there always will be. There are probably more artists that overdo it than underdo it, but yeah, it's okay. Actually, can we put the question up again? The first part of it was, what have I, since the book's release, or how comics have changed? Yeah. One of the nice things is when I did Reinventing Comics, which was about 6-7 years later, I did this chart of all of the different revolutions of comics, all the different ways that comics could grow and change and advance. And even though some of my hopes for digital comics kind of ran aground, at least temporarily, I think most of those revolutions have really taken place. If you think about them, they were, comics as a literary form, people doing more ambitious work in a literary space. That's definitely happened. Comics that were more artistically ambitious, people have continued to do tremendous experiments in that realm. The respect that comics has gained by institutions, universities, museums, the library system. We have so many friends in high places now. There are so many of us nerds have infiltrated, the world of art. Comics are more respected. Comics are far more diverse. Diversity was a very important thing for me. Diverse in many different ways, more diverse genres, more diverse styles, more diverse characters, and diversity of ethnic, racial background. All those things have been improving. They could improve a lot more, but they're getting better. And I also talked about gender balance. One of my regrets is that now, in retrospect, I realize maybe balance wasn't the right idea, because that's now I realize a little on the binary side.
Sure.
So we would have to say gender diversity now. or gender self-actualization, but that's become a real thing now. And then the business of comics has, I think, parts have continued to struggle. And I think I have a lot of regrets for the way the business went, but nevertheless, there are more people reading comics. A lot of them are kids, a lot of them are girls, and I am optimistic for the future there too. So, I mean, there's almost no area where comics did not go through tremendous progress in the last 27 years. Really long time.
Yeah, no, we're very clearly, I think at least, in a golden age of comics,
I agree.
in a way that 27 years ago, I don't think any of us could have actually pictured. I mean, well, you sort of did.
Kind of a
Yeah,
little.
but
Yeah.
I mean, I own a comic shop. I'll go back to that story I said at the beginning, where people used to go, "Oh, they still make these," and now it's like, "Holy shit, we want this."
Yeah.
That is not a change that even as a guy who put my whole living into, I'm going to sell comics, I never thought that was actually going to happen.
Well, you were one of the people making it happen, though, and that's
sure,
like you were one of the
never
frontline
believed that it would
warriors.
actually happen, that we would actually get there. Because, again, I will say that
Yeah.
when I opened the store in 1989, there were about 9 graphic novels that were in print. And by in print, I mean that would go back to press if they sold out, right? It's
Right.
one thing to print a book one time, right? But to keep going, but to have a Moby Dick, right? We had 9 of them back then, I remember, when Dark Knight and Mouse happened that same year, basically. And then everybody's like, okay, where's the rest? And
Right.
you go, well, there's ElfQuest, which is a great comic, but is nothing like those books, right?
Exactly.
You couldn't hand people the next book and the next book and the next book and the next book, which you can do today. If
Well,
someone,
this is it's the generational echo, right?
Yeah.
You have Dark Knight and Mouse comes out, and I hope I was saying something like this at the time, which was just like, hang on, you got to wait. You got to wait for the people who are inspired by that to take the time to put together their magnum opus.
Yeah.
And that's when they started coming out. And then it was Chris Ware, and then it was Alison Bechdel, and Craig Thompson and the Tamaki cousins. But it takes a while. It does. It takes a while, which is why it was good that I had Will Eisner as a role model, because he was very patient. He always said, "Oh yeah, I've seen the industry die like half a dozen times."
Yes, and so have I, many, many times.
Yeah.
Now, you were one of the earliest advocates for digital comics, for what digital could do for the form. And I think that a lot of your arguments were, from 10,000 feet, absolutely correct, right?
Yeah.
The empty canvas is an amazing possibility. And it opens up a lot of things that comics can do and can be. But digital never really took off in the way that you projected.
No, definitely not. It's my great Waterloo, is that I failed as an advocate to communicate the kind of things that I was seeing as a possibility. And in a lot of ways, I just retreated. I just said, okay, I'm going to have to wait. It's going to take another generation. And I went off and started working on, graphic novel that was going to take me 5 years. It's just, I consider it a defeat. I failed to get that across. It doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of digital comics. It doesn't mean that there are a lot of talented people working in digital comics, but the ones who were doing the work that I found the most exciting, the most interesting, they gradually moved on, and not a whole lot of people are doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think, it does take a while. I mean, like, for every major innovation, usually the ones that catch, usually there was a guy 20 years before that who was talking about it.
Sure, of course.
There's a 20-year cycle that Paul Sappho, the futurist, talks about this, the 20 years, where first everybody's a few people are talking about it in the coffee shops, and then suddenly it's on everybody's lips, and suddenly there's a prototype, and then it's happening, and then it fails, it crashes, it dies, it burns, and then a few years later it actually happens.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think maybe I haven't actually really looked at this, but I think possibly there are more pages of digital comics available today than there are pages of print comics.
Yeah, I think probably true. If you're, including, mobile and that sort of thing.
Well,
And we should say that the Korean model, the webtoons, they're all scrollers. I mean, they are kind of a lot like what I was talking about in a way. They're just, they're constrained on the x-axis or whatever.
yeah, yeah. And so the thing that worries me though about any model that we've been able to figure out is the monetization, right? Because a creator if you can't create comics and not get paid for them and continue to make comics. I mean, you can, but then you're doing it in your free time as a hobby, and
Right.
it's not the same thing, right? Like we want, if we can, I think we want a middle class of comics creators, right? Like
That's exactly right. Yeah. Well, one of my conclusions when I was working on this the first time was I thought that we had a generation that didn't want to make a killing; they wanted to make a living.
Yeah.
Right. So when everybody was talking about speculation and the stock market and like, oh, the digital whatever, I was just like, no, just don't even listen to those people. That's not the point.
Yeah.
I always saw it as a middle class creative class. So like when I was talking about micropayments, which was of course my real Waterloo, was that I failed to reinvent the entire world economy. I don't know why. It just seemed reasonable. Right. But the whole idea there was like, hey, if it's going to cost you a tenth as much to get it from A to B, then you should share the wealth, right?
Yeah.
So that the artist shouldn't be grabbing up that wealth, the reader should get it. But now I think the real promising thing is to have a reader's culture. And that's why the middle grade stuff is so exciting. That the genuine enjoyment, not collectors, not platinum duplicate cover shit or whatever. But just like I just read a couple of 200 or 300 page book and I'm desperate for the next volume. The sort of the Hardy Boys thing, to pick a very outdated reference.
Sure.
That if you have digital as like producing work that gets people excited in a particular genre of a particular kind with particular content, then those artists and those creations can very easily make the transition into print. But you have to have print formats that accommodate the experience of reading, and that's what I think really we've discovered with a lot of the middle grade stuff. It's just that is a satisfying experience.
Sure.
For kids.
I thoroughly stipulated. I guess one of the things that I'm trying to get at here is it strikes me that most stuff that's digital first that succeeds is because it's on the mobile. It's on the y-axis, I guess. It's the infinite scroll, right? But those things become difficult, not impossible, to then translate back into print, right? Because the experience is very different, right? And the way you read it is very different. You can do it. I've seen a couple of reasonably good examples, but they require a whole lot of post-production work to take it from one format to another.
This is really important, Brian, because I believe you should design for the device. That's my watchword. I hate repurposing.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about is the conundrum of like, nobody wants to do it twice, right? Nobody wants to, they've designed it for one form. They want to be able to push a button and have it magically go to the other one. It doesn't work that way. Comics, of all the narrative art forms, the shape of the presentation matters more in comics than anywhere else.
Yeah.
Like you can have the latest Christopher Nolan film on the big screen in a theater, and he doesn't want you to watch it on your phone. He really doesn't want you to watch it on your phone. But if you watch it on your phone, you're still experiencing the same art form. And you know what? If you're watching it on a really nice iPad, sitting up late at night with Bose headphones on, you are kind of getting the full Christopher Nolan experience, right? But that's because it's the same damn shape. It's the same fixed window through which you're looking at the world. It's not the way with comics. It really matters. Even just something as simple as, is it sideways or vertical? You know, much less is it like the scrolling thing versus is it on pages. It matters. If you're going to create something for print, it has to be created for print. If you're going to create something for digital, it has to be created for digital. And people are just they're too lazy. They want to just do it once and just click, and there it is again. And so they've got to hobble one or the other or both by creating something that's, well, it's sort of like this and it's sort of like that, but oh, I have to have it, you know, cut up into rectangles so that I can print it, or I took the printed thing and then I'm going to fly you through one panel at a time, and then you get to look at an M&M's ad or whatever. It's like, just create for the thing.
Because you hit problems where you're designing for the screen going this way, and the way you turn it into a print comic is you stack those two screens together. Except that breaks the language of comics, right?
It breaks the language, exactly.
The turn is here, but now the turn is in the middle of the page. You can't have a turn in the middle of the page. I mean, you can, but it doesn't work. It doesn't make use of the aesthetics of comics and the language of comics. It works against the language of comics.
Exactly. As much as I rag on the page thing in print, if you're going to make a printed comic, make a printed comic.
Yeah.
Make it so that it works on paper, so it's designed for paper. Make it good paper. Make it give a nice texture on the cover. That was something right at the very beginning of the web. We had stuff like Fort Thunder. Do you remember the Fort Thunder guys? Crazy ass mini comics and Dayglow, silk screen, you know, phosphorescent colors and editions of 17 with like twine binding and stuff. They were making objects.
Yeah.
And they were making objects at the very moment that the object was evaporating on the web.
Yeah.
Right. That the whole idea of the physical comic was beginning to disappear. They were making things that could only be seen as physical, because suddenly we saw paper for the first time. We discovered this thing that we were holding, and it was beautiful. You have to design for the device.
Yeah.
And that means if you have a character that's blowing up, you know, let's say you're doing some like the Adventure Zone. I think I hopefully I didn't call it the Adventure Time earlier. I would not confuse those things.
You did it right. You did it.
Okay, good. Yeah, something like Adventure Zone, where it's like this could have this could be transmedia, right? It could be in many different forms, and so there is an Adventure Time like little graphic novel series. But then if you're going to do a digital, it should be completely different. You're going to do a cartoon, it should be different.
Right.
You know, it's like, but each one is its own opportunity to create something that will make somebody money, right? because if you truly love the stories, the characters, the storyline, then you're going to experience it in those different media. You're going to go for all those different media.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how we find a formula that works to monetize the creation of art in comics that actually works for all participants. Because the thing that I see, and I talk about this a lot in this interview series, is we're graduating between 4 to 6 schools worth of new cartoonists every year. So we're talking about 100 new cartoonists are coming onto the marketplace every single year.
Absolutely.
Which is hard in a best case scenario, right? But we're in this position where we're giving them advances on books that, when you work it out on an hourly basis, are peanuts. I mean, they're not. Nobody can make a middle class living unless you're Raina, you know, and which is not a viable thing, right? And the punditry goes, well, but Raina exists and Dave Pilkey exists, therefore it's great, and this is the way you should go.
Well, we should say, okay, we have to compare apples to apples, though.
Sure.
Go back to when I was just starting out. Like, how many, you know, how big was the comics middle class? I'm not actually sure. I think that there was a lot of subsistence stuff going on there. Also, how big is the top tier now? Yeah, I think it's not just Raina, though. Actually, there are a lot of success stories, but they're all different. That is,
Sure.
all of those people have succeeded in a radically different way. It's hard to even think of them all at the same time.
Sure.
You know, like Ali Brosh is nothing like Raina, right?
Sure.
But that book sold like crazy.
Absolutely.
Marjan Satrapi or Alison Bechtel, they all succeeded in radically different ways. But there is that cruel, almost hockey stick like, you know, curve, right? Oh, it's so funny because I'm the left right thing. It's so weird. You know, there's that like, you know, like, okay, you have the people at the top and then the next tier and then and it goes like that. That shape sucks. I don't like that shape.
Yep.
I wanted it to be a lot easier and more affordable for people to try things. That's why I was trying to change the way the economic structure worked. But I don't know. It's
I mean, I'd almost argue we have a worse economic structure in terms of digital, right? Because I look at something like Webtoons, and what is, and I'm saying this with advisement, it looks to me like a Ponzi scheme, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's an awful lot of people who are producing a lot of work for free.
Yeah.
So that a couple of people can make a bunch of money doing it. And they're holding up those couple of people as, well, if you're lucky enough, then you can make the money too. But that's a shitty place to be as a person.
Well, it's a portal. I mean, like the problem is portals. And the reason we have portals is because people have very low tolerance for signing up for any kind of like just the monetary side of it. They only want to do that a few times. They just don't want to be giving out their credit card number every 10 days. That's why I wanted a form of currency. I'm so, see, now you're leading me back the garden path back to micropayments.
Yeah.
I wanted there to be a way for people to put dimes and nickels into each other's pockets, right?
Well, is this Patreon? Is Patreon then effectively micropayments?
It's still a portal, but I wouldn't call it's not technically micropayments, but it is demonstrating the same principle, which is the power of the consumer dollar when it's undiluted. And that's why what people like Spike are doing is actually spreading the wealth a little bit more than something like a portal like Webtoons is. But I'm not sure where it's all going, but crowdfunding generally as a concept does seem to be demonstrating some of the dynamics that I was talking about back then, which is there's real power in the consumer's pocket.
Yeah.
If it's not reduced way down. But now we have the all boats question, right? Is it a zero-sum game where if people start flocking to crowdfunding platforms, does that take it away from the retail market? Or if people are producing enough work that's genuinely exciting that we can increase the general readership? I don't know what the answer is to that. I know that you're still here.
Yeah.
That there are more actual comics on the shelves in America in one form or another than there were when I was starting out. But I don't know that we haven't solved the problem, but there's more diversity of content.
Yeah.
There are more people making comics. I don't know for sure that there are less people making any kind of a living making comics, but there are definitely a lot of people making nothing.
Sure.
There are a shitload of people making nothing.
Yeah, it feels like the general bar has dropped down while the top of the hockey stick, as you put it, is much higher than it used to be.
I think you may always get that with portals. If you have a gatekeeper, a publisher or a web presentation, gatekeeper, I think you might always have that shape. The question is, to what degree will we have that shape in an open network?
Let me pin that one, because I actually think, and of course I would, because I own a gate, but I happen.
Oh no, you're not. I'm talking about the publisher gates. I actually don't think of you as a gatekeeper.
I happen to think that having gates are a really fantastic thing, because it means that there's a minimum standard that one has to live up to, that you know, it's sort of this push and pull. Like, I think of James Tolchaka going, well, craft is the enemy, right? Well, like, he's right on one level, right? On one level, like, just producing work is awesome, but craft has to be the goal in a way. So I think that it's important
Are we sure about that? I
to
don't
have
know.
like me and my staff standing there going, these are the good comics. These are the comics you should be paying attention to. These are the things that will actually improve your life, as opposed to just anybody can just walk in and make comics.
All right, dude, I'm getting acid flashbacks to like 2003 right now. Okay, but I'm going to try to channel. I'm going to try to channel younger Scott.
Yeah,
43-year-old Scott now, because I'm even older. Here's what I think the ghost of Will Eisner would step in and say, and here's what 43-year-old Scott also said. First of all, I think craft is not the enemy. So I do disagree with that, but I actually think Kochalka really was just sort of planting that as a kind of, I don't know. It was a provocateur, but I think he did it. His heart was in the right place when he said that, and he got a really great conversation going. But on the other hand, I do not think we need gatekeepers for minimum standards. But what we need, and this is where you come in, is actually it's in the other direction. If you think of it as like, okay, in the old days when I was starting out, right, we had this superstructure of power and money, and the gatekeepers were all, can you come up into our castle, right?
Yeah.
And unless you could come up into the castle, you were invisible. Nobody could ever see you. Okay? I think gatekeepers are only useful in an inverted system in which talent is raining from the heavens, and some of it's crap, right? But some people can be your umbrella. So, and you're one of the umbrella people, right? Because you're not at the origin point. You're not creating this stuff. You're not the guy publishing that stuff, but you are the guy at the receiving end who can be our friend as consumers and say, I've done the work. I've been reading a lot. I've been looking at a lot of this stuff. Let me show you something wonderful that you might not know about. Oh, don't go over there. That's just the elephant boneyard. Just ignore that stuff. But over here is some really great stuff, right? But there, you're not preventing the hoi polloi from making their shitty mulch or whatever. You're not, you have no power to stop them. The old version, right? The power structure, the castle, they had the power to make artists invisible based on their aesthetic judgment. You don't have that power, and I don't think you want that power.
No, my power is the opposite power. My power is the power to make people visible.
Your power is the opposite power. Exactly. And that's what I wanted to see. I wanted to see at the receiving end, I wanted to see those, what if I called them critic circles. That's not really exactly what you're doing, but it's the filters. It's the people here at the receiving end who can help us find you're like what do they call the people who find water with the sticks? What's that old? A dowser. Yeah. You're a dowser, right? You're helping us find our way in that magical path.
I call myself a Sherpa.
Sherpa. Yeah, I use Sherpa too.
Path up the mountain.
Yeah. Sherpa is a good metaphor. But the important thing is, Brian, that nobody should ever have the power to make anybody invisible ever again. And that's the beauty of what we have now, is as crazy as it is, and as many starving artists as there are, and there are a lot of starving artists, nobody can be made invisible. Nobody can be stopped from putting their work out there. And there was a time when 99% of everyone who wanted to make a comic could be made to not exist. They could be made completely invisible by the castle. That was not a good system.
Didn't that stop in 78, more or less? I mean, ElfQuest, Cerebus. There's a lot of things that were self-created. I mean, to me, that was where comics were supposed to go.
Well,
I wanted 100 different companies that were all the creator. at
Dave,
the
yeah, but I mean, even then, I mean, like for many years, the books that didn't reach a certain threshold, Diamond wouldn't carry them.
Sure.
A lot, there were a lot of, as you know, a lot of the, the little stores, they couldn't afford to put the stuff out on the shelf. They just gave it to the subscribers, that kind of thing.
I understand that. I just I worry sometimes that those opportunities have disappeared because, ironically, the market seems to be moving towards the mainstream, or the mass market, as opposed to the specialty market. I think that particularly DC Comics would like nothing better than just to get the fuck out of the specialty market and only mass market. But that doesn't lead anywhere good creatively, right?
And we say mass market, you're talking Amazon and the bookstores?
Right, exactly, because those people are not selling comics because they care. They're selling comics because they can smell money.
Yeah, and I think we're probably gonna see. I think the chicken's coming home to roost as well. I noticed the bookstores. I think they're probably going to be closing in. Jim Killen just left Barnes and Noble, and I think he was a real friend to comics in a lot of ways, as best he could be. I think
Amazon is one of the worst things for creative people to exist. And at the same time, though, millions of people are able to put work on the market and sell 8 copies of it, And so from those people's point of view, we're doing great. We were able to sell 8 to 12 copies of our book. Terrific. But it's gutted the possibility for the middle class in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And it's funny because you talked about Eisner, and I think Eisner had it right in so many ways, but Eisner also kind of exploited people by putting them in a studio and
Oh yeah, no, that's yes, absolutely.
I'm going far afield.
It's a good footnote. Yeah, no, I mean, like he ran. People would call it a sweatshop and whatnot. And if you go back to that's actually not the Eisner I'm thinking of, because there were several different Will Eisners. There really were.
Yeah.
But the one that I would see at conventions would be when there was a panel. I was on this panel, and Gary Groff and a bunch of other people, and not just Gary, but people very unlike Gary. It was a pretty diverse panel. Everybody was talking about the real problem is that there are too many. Nobody is stopping the bad artists. Right. Nobody is stopping the kids from putting out bad stuff. We need somebody who will stop the bad stuff.
Right.
And Will came in. He was late for the panel, but I'll always remember he's just like, I don't think that. I don't think we should be doing that. And like I shared his feelings on that one, because I just thought that no, you don't stop the bad stuff. It has to work its way through. And the one who's doing the shitty stuff, it could turn out that they're going to completely revolutionize the medium in one way or another. And
Will was one of the few people who actually understood the value of the comic shop. He firmly believed in what we were doing and our ability to filter and our ability to promote things. I wish that more of my peers lived up to kind of what he wanted, rather than having clubhouses that are Marvel clubhouses or DC clubhouses.
Yeah. Can I just do one last revisit the top and bottom thing?
Yes.
Right? The bottom filter, the top filter. Just think of it that way. Think of it as like content raining down. You can have the castle decide who gets to rain down, or you can be there with your umbrella and help people to find the good stuff. Yeah. Imagine if Diamond had never been there to choke out that. If everything just kept raining down and it was just you. It was you guys helping us to find that stuff. But somehow it was just in the air. Right? You could sell, but it was just like, it was literally raining down, right? Like you didn't even have to go through a distributor. It's just like, there was just like all these books everywhere. This landscape full of it. They were just dropping left and right. And it was just up to you guys you were the ones who could go over and say, I found this thing in the pile. I'll sell it. I'll take half, right? I'll take my cut, buy this thing. It's great. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
That would have worked, right? At least that would have been better. It's like it's all about.
The reason I don't know it would have worked, and the only place I'm going to push back on you is hours a day, right? It's the same thing you're saying, that you've got a bookshelf of books behind you.
But it can be terraced, you see.
That I haven't read. You
can have the rough sort. Like you have different levels, right? You have the discerning guy down here who the pile has already been reduced because there's these different ways that people at different levels who are helping to sort through that stuff. But the back end filters are always better. It's always better to have somebody at the bottom when it's all raining down, but you can never stop somebody at the clouds. You can't stop them from raining down.
Yeah, no, that I agree with. We're at 2.5 hours here, so let's start trying to wrap this up. I want to talk about one more thing as a major thing to talk about, which is the Creator Bill of Rights.
Sure.
You were one of the instrumental people for that. There were what, 8 of you, 10 of you, somewhere in that range?
About 12, maybe at the summit, the second summit. Yeah.
Yeah. And so can you talk a little bit about what the climate was then when you were coming up with the Creator Bill of Rights and why it needed to be codified, and how the market is different today in your view?
Okay.
Is the Creator Bill of Rights still important? Is it still needed? Should there be a version 2 of it?
Yeah, I think of the Creators Bill of Rights. Okay, I'll do the 60-second history very quickly. There were a lot of disputes with Diamond and with various publishers and things like that. There were a lot of industry disputes. It was very much about the industry, and it was fueled in part by the firebrands and the self-publishers, and especially Dave Sim and the Turtle guys who had just come out, who were making tons of money at that point. And we were all saying, hey, this is the new Siegel and Schuster, except they didn't sign away their rights. Isn't that awesome? So they got together and they came up with something called the Creative Manifesto, which was a long, very hard to understand thing that was phrased like a contract. And that was at this summit that took place. I think it was in Toronto. And when they did a second summit in Northampton hosted by the Turtle guys, I was invited. I think Bassett was invited and he brought me along. I think I have that right. Or Larry brought me. I've forgotten which. Anyway, I had read that thing and I thought, nobody will understand this. Why don't we make it simpler? Why don't we just list our rights? And I remember I actually typed out, Larry was reading from my handwritten notes as I typed it out on my old manual typewriter. And we were like going to the copy shop, like halfway to Northampton, going from my apartment in Boston. It was all very crazy. But I was hastily putting this thing together, this proposal. And I put it out there, but the way I looked at it, it was very kind of pseudo-libertarian of me. I just saw it as just like, look, they can do whatever they want as publishers. They can do whatever they want as distributors. Here's what we're going to do. We're just going to say, hey, we have the power here. We're the ones actually creating the comics. Here's the kind of deal we'll sign and the kind of deal we won't sign. We won't sign any deal where we don't get to keep our originals. Won't sign any deal where we don't get to, make money or have control over it creatively. If they make a movie, whatever, we should, be able to make those decisions, all that stuff. But what we think of as just basic rights. But it's a statement of intent. It's us saying, hey, we make the comics. Here's what we're going to do with them. And that made sense at a time when the Turtles were coming along. Well, in the end, it didn't make any difference, really. I mean, the publishers just looked at it and laughed. Everybody kind of ignored it. In a lot of ways, it was ignored. We could say that the Image kids were aware of it. Valentino would say it was sort of influenced by, but I think in many ways, Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee, they would have gone ahead and done Image anyway, even if we weren't there with our silly bill. What it does provide is a snapshot of the kinds of things which weren't taken for granted in those days, that in many circles are taken for granted now. I don't think the bill did that, but I do think that it was always there as a kind of tuning fork so that people could point back to it and say, oh, you know what? Somebody wrote these things down. And I do think now it may not have brought about the world where this stuff is a little bit more expected, but it's, I think, more resonant with the world that we have now in some quarters.
Yeah.
Now, that does not mean that there aren't all kinds of entities, digital and print-based and otherwise, that don't want to screw over creators. And there's no question that there are plenty of people that would love to just hoover up all this IP and just make a ton of money from it, and then just kick the creators out the door the same way they did with Siegel and Schuster.
Yeah.
But it is a little harder now because the first impulse is you just want to be seen. And it's harder than ever to prevent people from being seen because they can just put their stuff on the web.
Yeah, but isn't the kind of implication of just putting your stuff up on the web meaning that you're not monetizing it in most cases?
Not necessarily. I think a lot of people feel that, like, if they do cultivate an audience, there's usually a way to monetize that. It's obviously an ugly word.
It's such an old word, but
I like to use, I mean, it is the word, but it's kind of gross. I like to think of it as a water wheel. It's just like, you got a raging river. There's always a way to build a water wheel. There's always a way. There's always a way. But the first thing you have to do is create something that people love, not the people that like. It's not enough to be liked. My watchword is good enough isn't good enough.
Yeah.
Anymore. It's not enough to be good. You have to be great. And you have to be great in a superlative way. That is, you have to be the most something. There has to be something that they can only find in you, or something where you are the premier, whatever the hell that is. It could be that you're just the best comic about fishing, or it could be that you're the most honest comic on the planet. It could be that you're creating the most beautiful work. It could be that you're creating the most addictive storyline. It could be that you're doing really good porn. It's just like, but it has to be something where it's just like, there's just nothing else quite like it.
Yeah.
Being just good, being the second best at anything. People just don't care. There are too many choices.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes hard to know what that indefinable quality is. And there are a lot of very good cartoonists, and I've talked to some of them, who are just treading water, and they have been for years, some of them for decades, and they can't figure out why. And a lot of the time, if you really look hard at what they're producing, it's good work that in no particular way is exceeding somebody else. It's not at the top of their game in any one way. It's just near the top. That's not enough.
Yeah. Is it likely that a cartoonist has a shelf life measured in actual decades, or is it measured in years, do you think?
Well, I'm going on three and a half decades myself.
Sure. But you've got one really, really successful book.
Yeah, no, it is the one good book principle. And I've made money from a lot of other things I've done, but understanding comics is kind of it raises the floor, right? There's always that floor that I can't fall below because I had that one thing.
Right.
But that is often how it works. It's on a logarithmic scale, whatever. I think most people, the different things they do, there's the most successful thing, then there's the next one. That's just sort of the way it goes. There are exceptions, but
am I wrong in thinking that even today a significant percentage of your income is understanding comics, and then the opportunities that flowed from that, like speaking?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a sense, all opportunities flowed from understanding. I mean, you can't really uncouple that. So technically, everything that happened after understanding, if you plucked understanding out of the timeline, it's hard to know if that thing would have even existed. But putting that aside, I think that I think it's still a chunk. It's not necessarily half, but it's it's a significant part of it. It's just that I have that book out there.
Yeah.
And in the series that grew out of it, you could sort of say that's half just the book. I'm always trying to transcend that, There's still a potential movie deal for The Sculptor. There are still some scenarios in which I'm, understanding comics might be my other book.
Right.
I remain ambitious enough that I hope someday to do that. Yeah. The book I'm working on right now is, this massive book on visual communication that it has tremendous breadth and involved in a huge amount of research. and maybe it'll be a drag, and maybe it'll be amazing. I kind of think it's going to be amazing, but I could be wrong, you know. Um, but 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 I think it's very often there's just that one book, that's that one work that kind of looms above the rest. I think that's for most careers, it's that way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting thing. So your new book on visual communication is coming out next year, 2022.
No, we don't have a firm
Okay.
publishing date. It involved a huge amount of research, and it's taken a long time. But I'm well along on it. But I don't know. I don't want to give dates because it's only going to come back to haunt me.
Are you like fully thumbnailed, let's say?
Nearly fully, yeah, nearly fully.
Okay. All
And
right.
but it's up around 500 pages, and that thing's got to come down. It
Mhm.
can't be that long. It's too long.
Have you started any of the execution of the actual pages?
No, I never draw a single page until I have. And remember, when we say thumbnails, they ain't thumbnails.
Understood.
They're super finished looking.
Mhm.
In many ways, I suppose you could say I've really already started the pages. In fact, this time I might actually take those roughs, so to speak, and just treat them as the bottom layers. And because the lettering, I've actually been lettering it on top of it. It's just, they're almost quasi, I don't know, they're semi-finished pages, really, if I'm to be honest with myself.
Yeah. What's your process like? I'm kind of thinking that you must work fully digital these days.
I have been working fully digital since 2000.
Yeah. Okay.
So for the last 20 years, there is no original art.
Okay.
If there was even the New Adventures of Abraham Lincoln, which is like 1999, there was no original art.
Right.
The last thing that had original art was, SCOTT Understanding, and that's it.
Is there value in having original art as a cartoonist trying to make a living?
Yeah.
Like able to sell
people sell it, but like my artwork, I'm not Craig Thompson or anything. I'm not Craig Russell. Not anybody named Craig.
Yeah.
Like, it's just my work is not the kind of thing that people would be clamoring to buy. So it's just like, so that it wasn't as big a sacrifice for me. But the big thing for me, remember I said the thing about design for the device?
Yeah.
To me, the original art is what gets printed.
Yeah.
That is the original. Then I would have told you that. 24-year-old me would have told you that. It's why I used brush markers when I was doing SCOTT.
Right.
I believe very, very strongly that you had to think in terms of the finished printed page. The printed page was the work of art. Everything else was a tool that you used to achieve that printed page. Anything that made that page better, fine. If you had to start using, like a porcupine quills to get that, if you had to use disappearing ink, if you had to use egg whites, it doesn't matter. Whatever gets you that's what mattered. Because if I had to start thinking about what I could sell at a convention, I would have signed an agreement with the devil. I was a real purist with that.
I understand. I just, again, I ask these questions thinking about younger artists and thinking about where their lives are going to go and what the possibilities are for them, and I think that some artists have cut themselves off from a source of revenue.
I think first of all, I don't know that most originals probably don't go for that much, to be quite honest.
Sure.
I think crowdfunding is probably a more promising revenue stream than that, especially things like Patreon, where you get a certain number of people giving you a couple of bucks a month. You might actually be able to, it'll at least pay more than, working down at Costco. Yeah. But I think that there are certain artists, there are certain kinds of artists who are doing gorgeous work. They're doing conventionally beautiful work. And there, I think the original becomes very important. And
again, I think that if you're doing a 200-page graphic novel, even if you only sell your art for $100 a page, which is low, that's still $20,000. I mean, that's
but you're not going to sell all those pages.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I think that's the. I mean, it's we talk about the scarcity of attention and the scarcity of consumer dollars. I think that, it's just there are only so many collectors. There are a lot of artists out there making this stuff. So I think you'd find that in some ways, it's not even really a supply and demand issue. In other words, the person who only sells one page a year at $100 wouldn't necessarily sell 100 pages at $1.
Understood.
I think they'd probably still sell, maybe they'd sell a couple of pages.
Right.
It's just like it's just that people aren't banging down their door to buy pages. Now, I could be wrong. There could be a very thriving originals market right now, but I hadn't gotten that impression. Have you seen evidence that folks are buying a lot of originals?
I've seen some evidence from some cartoonists that they're able to make a secondary revenue stream. Not it's certainly not a primary revenue stream for them, but when you're talking about I know cartoonists for a 200-page book that are getting a $10,000 advance, and that's not $1,000 up front. That's $10,000, and then you produce 50 pages. Sorry, it's $2,000, and then you produce 50 pages, and then you get another $2,000.
Right.
Like
it's nothing basically.
You can't live off of it, and so
you're literally making less than you would flipping burgers.
Exactly. And that's terrifying.
No.
That's the thing that scares me is that people who are doing work of lasting value and lasting craft are not able to make a living from doing that work. Which is, to me, part of the problem of having too much choice in the market right now. And that's why I often think that having less choice would be a better thing. But
this is the eternal debate. And look, it is a legitimate position, and it's one that a significant number of people have felt that way for a long time now. And ghost of Will Eisner aside, it's a gut feeling that I'm going on that the real, like, the pathway is not about artificial scarcity, which in some ways that's sort of an artificial scarcity idea, but it's more about the reading experience. That, in other words, that if the reading experience in all respects was superior, if people got more joy panel for panel and paid less money per minute, which is a real key thing, because you're comparing it against video games versus movies versus binging the latest Netflix show, right? Then there would be enough readers to support a lot of these people who right now are struggling.
And I intellectually agree with the thing that you're saying on an intellectual plane, but when it gets down to the weeds of it, it seems to me that no one can ever compare against Netflix, right? $15 a month and
portals. Portals. It's the problem with portals. It's why I wanted there to be a freestanding currency, because when you have a currency, you can have thousands of vendors. But when there's no cash, if you don't have some form of cash, then you're going to have 2 or 3 vendors. That's why we have Netflix, Amazon, Apple, and the rest. But that's another situation. That's a whole other thing. Wait, there's a much more important thing.
Ultimately, it's destroying art, I think. I mean, again, some people do very well in that circumstance, but most people do very mediocre. And,
I will say, and again, this is the ghost of Will Eisner. There has always been something destroying art.
Oh, true. No,
always.
Absolutely.
And I think right now it's not. I think that particular hoary monster is not actually as efficient at destroying art as it once was. I think right now art is kind of winning. But maybe compare it to acting, right?
Right.
It's just like, how many actors are there waiting tables? How many actors exist? How many actors are doing community theater and getting enough to buy a pizza at the end of it? They vastly outnumber the number of people on movie screens. Technically, nobody's on the movie screen right now, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
And I think it's a little bit like that. It is the greatest job in the world. I can confirm this. When I'm not worried about money, which I have been many times in my career, I've been worried about money. But when I'm not worried about money, it is the greatest job imaginable. It is a fantastic job. People are right to want to do it. But it is like acting. A lot of people they want to be cartoonists. They want to be artists. Animation has given a way for a larger number to have some kind of participation in that, because it takes a lot of people to make a movie.
Yeah.
But
comics,
yeah,
animation
but they're
comics, you know, they're similar. They do similar things.
yeah,
But
they're different. They're different.
This brings us neatly to the penultimate question.
Yeah.
We have a lot of people who watch this series of videos who want to be cartoonists.
Yeah.
You're talking to someone who's interested in being a cartoonist. What's your piece of advice? Whether that's a physical tool task thing or whether it's a philosophical thing, what do you say to someone who wants to be a cartoonist?
Well, my personal like creed, as far as learning goes, and it's all about learning, really, is to learn from everyone and follow no one. And I believe that very, very strongly, which means that you should keep an open mind, and anything that makes anyone excited, even if it's not your thing, try to familiarize yourself with it. Try to see how many different ideas you can fall in love with, because you can learn so much from all these diverse ideas. And then don't declare yourself any kind of cartoonist. Never call another artist God. Never use the word God. Nobody has all the answers. Everybody's fallible. Find your own path. Make your own path. But learn from everyone, and then look for connections. Look for the ways that these very different artists are related, and you're going to start to see patterns. Learn from those patterns. Work hard. Finish something. You got to finish something. Finish something soon. Work on something small. Make it available. Put it on the web, or go down to your local store and see if they have somebody buying mini comics for 25 cents and putting them on the shelf. Go to small press shows. Meet other cartoonists. Ask them about what they love. But then ultimately, the goal of it all is to create something that people cannot ignore. And it could take you years to create something that people cannot ignore. That's really, really hard. But that's the key. You have to create something that they can't find anywhere else, that readers cannot find anywhere else. Something you do that no one else can quite do as well, or can quite do as convincingly, or as honestly, or as beautifully, or as cleverly, or whatever. There has to be something that you have that nobody else has. Find it, and then just work really, really hard. And the day that you find that you have more readers that you know what to do with, the rest, by then the industry will have reinvented itself 5 or 6 times.
Yeah.
But it's okay. There's always a way. There's always a way to make that work for you. Always.
Absolutely. The last question, you talked about it a little bit, but is there a thing you would like to plug?
I'm looking at a lot of middle grade stuff right now.
Yeah.
We always bring up Raina in connection with that, but I got to say that Jen Wang's last couple, Stargazing and The Prince's Dressmaker, I believe it is.
Yeah.
There's something really magical about the way she draws.
Yeah.
There's a lot of line work leaves me with this kind of like inner scraping noise. Like there's this kind of slightly dissonant thing. It's just like the lines are never quite right. There's a silence and eloquence to the way those lines are set down. I just really love that stuff. I don't know exactly why. It's just really works. And then the other, I'm always keeping an eye on the surrealist side of things.
Yeah.
Longtime fan of Jim Woodring, but I have to say I really like what Jesse Jacobs has done in the last few years. Stuff like Crawl Space, or an older piece, Safari Honeymoon, that I thought was really good.
Yeah.
That stuff's really freaky and interesting. And then I don't know, there's a particular kind of a sort of post Miyazaki sensibility that's been showing up in a lot of stuff by people they may consider themselves more illustrators or like production designers or game level designers or whatever. I don't know what they are. I keep seeing them on the web, but there's there's an approach to color that I really like, and a kind of look. A lot of it is kind of, I don't know. A lot of it intersects with kind of the genderqueer stuff and a sort of like pastel, semi-chibi internationalist approach that several artists are tapping into, and I feel like they're tapping into a common energy and influencing each other to a degree. It doesn't have a name yet, and I couldn't tell you a single artist except that I've created lists on Twitter where I seem to be like looking at several of them at the same time. So that's like a nascent thing that's an Oort cloud. It's just like some celestial gases that are starting to form that I find really interesting. And then I don't know. It's hard to. I could look behind me. There's just I don't know. It's just a very strange time. I feel like we're at a time of transition.
Yeah.
But unlike the last few years where I felt like we were kind of in retrograde, maybe because of the political situation, I feel like there's a certain forward momentum right now.
Yeah.
But I don't quite know what we're heading to. And that might have more to do with my own particular forward momentum after some retrograde times.
Sure.
It might just be that I feel like I'm moving forward.
Well, you've got a new book that you're working on visual language. You said, do you have any fiction in the hopper, or are you just firmly in the nonfiction at this point?
I do, but unfortunately, it's top secret. There's a sort of a thing that I'm working on, but I can't. It's sort of a thing on the side. But
do you have for that, is this something we're going to see in the next 3 or 4 years, or is it longer off?
Yeah, both that in the book. Yeah,
okay,
certainly 3 or 4. That's a very generous window. Thank you, Brian. That's like 3 or 4. Yes, you'll see both projects.
Okay, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. You're an amazing cartoonist, I think, and I appreciate it. Like all cartoonists, you are always self-depreciating, but I love your craft and I love your skill. I love the attention that you put to it and the thoughtfulness that you put into your work. And I cannot wait to see more from you. You are one of my favorite cartoonists who only puts out a book every 5 or 6 years.
That's true. Yeah.
So the more that we get from you, the better. I want to thank you for taking this time. Nearly 3 hours of talking to us about comics and making comics and how comics are made and why we make them and all of these things. The book that we were particularly talking about is, of course, Understanding Comics. If you do not have this in your comic book library, at you person at home, you should for sure have this in your comic book library. It is a book about understanding comics, and it is comics, and that's the most amazing thing about it. It is so fucking good. Scott also has other fantastic books like Zot. He's also done making comics. I would pull up a copy of Sculpture, but we literally sold it about 3 hours ago. But like 6 hours ago, we sold our copy today.
Weirdly, I can't find my copy either. It's. I would pull my laptop off.
Yeah, very good.
The cord here. I've got the cord.
So let's see. Next month's book is a first-time graphic novel from Jonathan Hill called Odessa. This is a beautiful kind of post-apocalyptic story that's set in the Bay Area, and it's all in pink, which I kind of love. It also has my favorite book plate of any book plate that anyone's done for us yet, because the store is actually in there. You kind of can't tell from this picture.
Oh, that's cool.
I love it. I'm so happy with this. That's our graphic novel of the month club. Our kids club this next month is Mega Dogs of New Kansas. We'll be talking to them. Cool science fiction story. And then our classic comics masterpiece next month, I am talking to Stan Sakai, author of Jimbo, who is a cartoonist. So those are all very exciting things. But this month, our book has been Understanding Comics. And again, I really want to thank Scott McCloud for being a part of this conversation. I want to thank Jordan for doing our tech support and doing the show. Indeed. I want to thank Kat and Zoe for running the store and keeping me honest and keeping things alive. I want to thank The Beat for sponsoring us. And I want to thank all of you watching at home. being a part of these conversations and watching these things and keeping comics and keeping comic shops and keeping cartoonists alive, because you, the audience, are the thing that makes all of this possible. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you all. And again, thank you, Scott, for taking the time today.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it.
All right. We'll see you next month, folks. Take care.